我是6，我觉得我可以到6000多。
但可是7000多还是差了很多哎。
而且沙溢的移动已经很快嘞，我可以移给你看。
沙溢有比南拳快吗？
我觉得不会比较慢，我给你看为什么。
因为我在想黑棋其实已经很快了，黑棋也是很快的。像我移动到另外一个，我就直接技能开一开，然后咻咻咻顺过去就到了。
因为它沙溢就是那个滑板啊。
对啊，
滑板其实开加速之后很快。可是这边中间到时候是没有怪的。
对。
然后你看啊，假如说我滑板开加速之后，刚好卡住，我把怪吸。
滑板真的蛮容易卡。
不是，是因为现在有怪。
有怪会。
不然这一段路是绝对不会卡。然后把怪吸一起，然后再从这里。你看我假如说滑板，然后我配个加速之后超级快。
哦，
你看有没有很快？
那我在想，
我知道来回，然后，其实这个加速你有用过吗？其实你也没有。
没有，我没有在用沙溢。
对，其实很快，我觉得不会比光这2个点移动啊，不会比任何职业慢。
也是。
因为只有2个点啊，如果要多点移动，南拳一定快。可是2点移动的话，我觉得还是他找到更近的点，那就有可能。
也有可能，我也不太清楚。
因为这2个点其实是远的，比我上次感觉的远。
可是我觉得这2个点比较不会被抢，比较好一点。
对啊，这2点比较不会说怎么打这个点，另外一点人就来了，遇到那个就很麻烦。
真的。对啊，怎样？我的可以差2块啊。
说沙塔还是？你说沙塔还是 N2？N2
吗 ？N2 吧。
N2 2条啊 ，N2
基本上都是2条了。
然后再加沙塔，你可以插到最多3到4个。一般都2条。
不是额外哦，不是额外吧？
什么叫额外？
额外的固态硬碟。
就是
低潮1草不是啊，你就算只差1个，你也可以分到低潮1草啊，就看你怎么分而已啊。
你要分几层，几槽都可以。
你不是一个硬碟哦。
你可以 M2 当系统碟啊。
我也是 M2 当系统碟，
会比较快，你整个电脑会比较快。然后沙塔当储存碟。
我的储存碟是传统硬碟啊。
我也有用传统硬碟。因为其实储存资料传统硬碟还是最好的。它的记录方式是最好的。
但我知道为什么我之前追汉哥都打不了牌了，他妈的，就是放在传统硬碟。
可是我好像也是用，我忘记了，我忘记我是传统硬碟还是啥。
我现在只要是这种，我就不放传统硬碟。像黑沙放传统就没差。
黑沙，因为黑沙是吃网络。
对。不是，应该说还是会有一点差， 可是就还好。
德本的祭司 buff 在这里，我记得在这是那个，可是我有点忘记是。
你打谢勒很会吃祭司哦？
没有啊，可我等一下想吃吃看。因为我记得祭司会加命中。
哦，干，可是我现在在想，到底有没有必要？这些东西是有没有必要？因为其实我们已经超过这个猎场了。
我原本是只吃那个，我觉得套餐要吃。
套餐我会吃，
其他可以不用吃，因为套餐很便宜，几十万。
对啊，
套餐吃，然后那个吧，帐篷我好像吃。
帐篷我会吃那个回能量生活发现。
真的哦，帐篷我是，对我今天那个一直不够用。
对，所以我觉得吃回能量会好一点。
可是我今天吃那个就是能量剂一直不够用，回能量的，可是我不知道会不会影响伤害
我不太清楚
我看一下帐篷加什么，帐篷有没有加命中？
没吧？你说哦帐篷哦，帐篷我就不知道了。
我自己实测，可是我是实测废墟，所以好像不太记得。就是当攻击力增加一定量的时候，是很有体感，还有命中。可是
这难说
可是废墟又比谢勒罕还要强。
我那个时候是觉得感觉谢勒罕，因为我们已经超过很多了，所以我就没有再。
所以我就吃帐篷的加伤和那个，我吃这两个，就是帐篷加伤跟料理。
我是吃那个生活发现跟料理，就吃这两个。
生活发现。我现在要给他开始补给能量，我今天用到不够用。我现在杀意可能又没多少能量，好像才回到200而已。现在开始吃药，164，从现在开始吃应该来得及。
164哦，
可以啊，我都这样，我都。直接一直吃。
看164去打，你就算现在吃2罐，顶多回100而已，不是吗？我
等下10分钟后又可以再回
嘛。所以你不会弄到满再去打啊？
平常会弄到满，只是我就边吃边打。也可以啊！
靠，这个超大还长得太高了吧？
边吃边打的话，这样就来得及。
哦，
就你可能不一定要回满，因为你想，你10分钟可以回100，你10分钟顶多打。
哦，你是回100哦？你是吃2罐的哦？
因为我这还有剩。
我是只吃1罐的。
哦，因为我还有剩，反正他一定会改版。
对啊。
所以这个一定，
改版，垃圾。
叶哲刚刚说什么大字？
没有超大回复啊，现在贵到炸。
因为现在有些热汗了。
现在有些人，现在还养得起这个啊？你要不要你怎么不用你的角色去做？
对，我觉得你可以打谢热汗。
我一直有在做啊，我一直在做。
业者可以打谢热汗的，其实。
你看一只角色就可以做2瓶，光这几只，
我可能主要500亿啊。
对啊，而且主要是
7只，
要求又不会太高，钱有一定的那个水准。
看一只
我现在有时间我会烤肉。
等下我算一下，一只角色做2，
他的花肉。
27只也才
先
长
存起来，让我没空的时候可以打工。
这个我觉得谢瑞涵能量值得啊，他赚的钱多。
真的。
你平常也不知道你能量要用在哪里。
这不是啊？哦，业者在挖肉啊。
对啊，
他可以拿那个。
你可以战斗角先战哇，
对啊，你可以拿你的驯兽去打。
没有，他现在主杀役了，他现在全转杀役了。
哦，
他连客家卡都杀役。
哦，你是直接转哦，你不是用绑的哦。
我是转了，
他是转，他已经放弃那个小驯兽。
那个白痴的兽娘，帮我改。
放弃那个小驯兽了。我看有人会这样就是现在柱子旁边，然后摆帐篷。
哦，你说然后跑去另外一柱是不是？
没有，然后他就走了，然后他就时间到了再过来，然后就说他要摆帐篷。
干，我觉得有摆帐篷真的很靠北。
对吧？
干，又不是摆帐篷就你的。
对啊，他干我屁事？那你排队妈摆椅子哦。排队摆椅子哦啊！
这真的很智障。
就跟那大妈
那什么
帐
篷站点真的是一个很智障的事情。
干，又不是每个人都有帐篷，你知道吗？而且有时候也有迷信，是你开着帐篷的时候，感觉就不会掉，对不对？
就算有帐篷，我也觉得没必要
对啊，帐篷有一个好处就是你可以快速让人家知道这边有人在打，
但你又没在打，
他不是拿来战斗，
对啊，
他不是拿来战。对，就像上次那个在废墟说要你走500帐篷，然后不爽，直接开嘎。业者不知道，业者在当兵。
但是我上次那个打特区阿废墟还放不了帐篷，因为在水里，靠北。
业者，我上次在刷爱珍的时候遇到智障。
啊？
我上次在刷爱珍的时候遇到智障。
对啊，
就我在跟郭一成聊天，然后边刷，我就刷慢慢刷，然后我用沙溢刷，就遇到一个就直接刷，然后他说他刷一段时间没看到我，我说我在这边刷2个小时，然后他就说他就继续刷，他就继续抢，他就说我刷一段时间没看到你，然后说你也没放帐篷，然后我说我在这边刷2个小时，然后我就不爽，然后我沙溢就把那个时间打完之后，我就切回蓝就开始杀他，然后就守他的死，因为沙溢打架打不赢啊，沙溢他不是还适合打一打，因为他追不到人。
说实在，你的沙溢说不定跟我黑棋打都打得很辛苦，就算 AP 差这么多，
因为他追不到人，然后就
对啊，
没办法。然后我就守他的尸体，把他杀了几次，杀到快要变红的。
如果菜鸡公会就直接宣战杀。
那我不是副会，就比较麻烦。
你就请示副会，
请示副会帮我宣谁谁谁。其实我看他们很多就是说帮我宣谁谁谁。
对啊，我们这边
他
是还好，
们想宣就宣了，都没差。
因为宣战也不用多少钱。
对啊，
宣战到底多少钱啊？一天？他是用
没很多，真的没很多，一点点
他是
而已。
要一天去算吗？
我记得不是什么前3天怎样，然后之后
5万而已，宣战费用15万
，15万。然后你如果一直维持宣的，
好像是多少之后会变贵吧？可是也没有到非常多的样子。
应该他没有多写什么。 一下要去挖肉了。
你怎么估你每次挖肉的时间？
啊？
你怎么估你每次挖肉的时间？
能量满了就去挖。
哦，你会躺床吗？
不会，我就骑马，然后吃那个中型的能量回复剂。
哦，
中型便宜啊。
其实躺床蛮舒服的、啊，
有马练就练个马。
他现在改，嗯，
打谢热汗一定要吃大型啊，不然我觉得回不回来。
他现在那个
能量还会
受祝福的指令书，他改成120分钟。
受祝福的指定书。
嗯，那个战斗经验加200的那个。
哦，以前是100。
对啊，他现在改成2小时。他说要改成60分钟为那个的，
受祝福的指定书，
这样拿为单位的。
那有什么？
加200，战斗加200，技能
然后
加30。
加30。
哦，它不是本来就2个小时哦？
没有，原本是100分钟，一个阿萨布鲁的数字。
哦，
这个超多张的，都要用不完。然后他现在改2小时，又更用不完。感觉之后可以把稻草人挂业者。
稻草人
4周后有那个经验1加1000，
加1000，我有看到。
干那个加1000真的很屌，
那个有点屌，我觉得那个有点屌。
那里
我就靠你的那个寺庙了。
我一定洗好洗满啊！
我觉得我们全部去靠那个吴镇宇的，我觉得我的
叫吴镇宇赶快打啊！
我的方不太够，我靠这4周看能不能再撑这层。我看下一阶是多少好了，不然我现在防御有一点少，有一点缺乏，还会被秒杀。好久没看那个版面，叫吴镇宇打。如果我们2个一起打，就可以2个一起吸。
对，
稀烂，
吸爆，吸炸。
反正我和卢克豪肯定是打不了的，只能期望你们了。
加油加油
！377才过下一分。
这4周根本什么东西都撑不上去了，我顶多弄出一个那个吧，东戒指。
我要疯狂搞卡普才有办法。
我也没时间。
除非我换成中纳克。
你们防具都冲到，你们马具都冲到+6是不是啊？
没，我马具现在也只有1件啊，我最近
我+6、+7、+8都有。
所以我才想要赶快那个，
赶
快叫你们一起打
我马具差1件。
我好像2件还是3件+6，然后+7。
我插马面了。
可以啊，你是做风吗？
大地啊。
哦，赞哦，以后3个都有了。
我终于，我只有1个是换的，其他都买的。
马蹄铁得换吧，那个生意
买
真的是。
对啊。
你买到？
买到啊。
交易所
对啊，买到3件了。
好屌啊！
现在差马面还没买到。
他那个曼莎娃娃，他曼莎娃娃开出来之后，我觉得会更好买一点。
曼莎娃娃
那个竟然买得到，这那么便宜竟然买得到？你是买+6的？
没有白板了。
中马蹄铁哦。
对啊。
他预购好少哦。 大地的预购好少。
那你也是你真的是蛮晒的。
我觉得
还好吧，你挂你也买得到啊。
我是说你是买大地，
交易量才几十件而已耶，
没啊，是说业者是买大地啊。
不是？我看大地的累计交易量也才30几件而
哦，
已啊，
对，靠背。
很少耶。他说到现在多久？
买到。
还是你买个那个驴子的？
你买到的运气其实很好，它累计交易量超低。
驴子是加生活经验的，
疯的反而最好买。
驴子，
对吧？你看驴子的那个啊，
我看一下，
不是驴子的能给驴子蛋靠呗。
我看一下啊。
可是他生活经验可以到20%18%
真的吗？
你看啊
10%而已，不是吗
？5件它是3个都有还是
5件效果加10%啊
？10%也行啊。
很多
哎，驴子，
不是，它是生活经验值，是你骑在马上才有那个效果，还是你只要召唤出来就有？
不是啊，
没有
咆哮啊，
它是咆哮啊，它应该也是对啊。
哎看，不错
有点屌有点屌
看这也是买不到啊，
他要怎么做啊？
我不知道，
不是买不到哦。
他累计交易
量
量1件啊，他累计交易量1件啊，
看，啊现在预购成那样，
他累计交易量1件
哎要怎么做啊？这样卢卡要做啊？
我看一下他怎么做，干有点屌干你怎么会发现这种东西？靠背
没有啊，我就刚才随便按一按，我就想说看一下驴子的到底在干嘛，就看到了。
这驴子还蛮强的。
五彩卵石是什么？
不知道，根本没听过这个东西。
驴子是大地、风、水、碎片都各一点，还好。他不用，他不用那个，他不用呻吟好像很屌，好像很好，好像还不错做只是他有一堆珊瑚，金珊瑚。
五彩卵石到底是啥？
不知道。
我看一下五彩卵石交易所有没有卖。它看起来最难做的是五彩卵石，因为它五彩卵石一件只要3颗。但五彩卵石没有，只有光明石。
那可能是不能卖的啊。
查一下，
到底是三小？
五彩卵石，
感觉
五彩卵石，查一下。
去露露飞。
五彩卵石，其中五彩卵石实在太难取得了。
一看就知道，哇塞！
所以五彩卵石这么大，
干你娘嘞！每天只能获得7枚那个月换的东西，你要100枚才能月换一个五彩。
靠北。
700，还好啊。
吧
，15天，那2个月就做出4件了。
做一件装就要3颗3颗五彩。
哦，对五彩只有这个方法可以拿到。
对啊。
笑死！
我看一下驴子装备准备，拉缪班斯硬币做的7枚，彩虹野花硬币。
靠背，我不要，我不做。看为了10%，
你可以换海獭硬币，可以补足啊，可以补足硬币 那你解那个拉缪那个日记啊就可以啊。
哦，
那个日记不是也给蛮多硬币吗？
有吗？
我不太，
我记得他都会给，你知道吗？
为什么我找不到
我找到我找到做那个驴子克罗格达鲁的装备的前置啊。
看会做这个的也是很闲。
他是真生活玩家啊，真生活玩家，屌吧？
不想做，看起来就很麻烦
可以加长时间，哦，半小时。哦，他驴子的咆哮只有30分钟而已。
也够了。
本尊冒险后1000日达成，要替荷包默哀。驴子穿金马具速度可以到多少？请问能找你帮忙放个驴具 buff 吗？我是阿库西斯教团慧慧，今晚8点想要卖将近100万箱的贸易箱子，需要各种生活经验值的加成。三小，
为什么感觉这么智障啊？
我看他们的玩黑鲨都会改黑鲨的字体。
对，都改得很可爱。
嗯，然后他们有些字体都蛮好看的，说真的。也要开始打了，回城。
知道，还有人在
时
旁边呢。
间到了。
吃个料理，买个周文书。
干魔女怎么感觉没有多好打啊？
看有人在打，
哎，卢卡尔也在。
那我只能打单注而已。
卢卡奥在哪？
我刚刚看到国师无双登出。
哦，
我只能打单注了。这样我单注和双注收益是不是差蛮多的？
差蛮多，我觉得会差蛮多。
看要不要切屏？切屏好了。
可是你说切屏，现在这时间可能你要找到有双注的有点难，
真的啊、
我觉得啦。
这里有人打，我就只看这3屏，看工会屏。感觉双注打起来比较爽。
干，
哦，卡玛伊
哦，欧晶晶腰带
哦，哎，你有开5000万吗？
没啊？对哦，干，
你觉得要开吗？其实有时候不一定会回本。
真
但就只
的。
是爽。
算了，我这次懒得开，我魔女先拿来试水。
但就只是爽，有时候只是爽。哦，跳起来，我以为我紧紧腰带，结果
干，我知道为什么了，我忘记特化了。
看是不是有人在跟我抢铜柱啊？
怎么会有抢同一柱的问题啊？那不是就一直站在旁边的吗？
他也跟我抢同一柱，
什么意思啊？你说等你打完，他就跑过来偷按一下能量啊？
没有，他也是打双柱。
哦，
哦，那我想要搞到他生气哦。
看为什么一直被晕啊？烦死了！
嘿嘿，抱歉，是我。杀一抢柱好屌啊！那个伤害量直接碾压。
有点不太想打了，不太想用魔女玩了，
为什么？
还不如黑棋。虽然我没有技能特化，但是也不会差这么多吧？靠背。哇，为什么一直被晕啊？看有没有特化差很多吗？好像差蛮多的欸。
我也不知道。哦，这个人看起来快爆气了。他说：“搞试试吧。”他要开红了是不？我就喜欢搞大陆人。
搞起来啊！
他打我不会痛。哦，有，开始痛，开始痛。哦，可以哦。那我要换脚喽。
好，我不打了。魔女不行，
魔女不行啊，魔女打
正
对。
式宣告魔女放弃，魔女还是我的点装脚就好了。不，干我明明都打了一整套了，打不死一只欸，为什么这么弱啊？亏我觉得魔女很好玩。
要看猎场吧。
没有，我觉得不是猎场的问题啊。谢勒罕已经是很好打的地方嘞。应该说，照理说最三招最痛的那3招打下去，他的血就至少要剩2、3成而已了。但就是感觉不太行。果然，人家说的是对的啊。
下去了。
他妈的，魔女已死。还是我弄个技能特化之后，晚上再来打一次试试看。
嘿嘿嘿，杀掉他一次的，好爽。
哦，所以你们已经在开干。他 APDP 高吗？
差不多，我们2个差不多。
好吧，那我不能去闹了。
你不能来闹，你不能，你会死。反正我刚刚赚够钱，我现在没有一定要赚。
好吧，至少打到了一个腰带跟一个文物。
你打完了？
不是啊，我受不了了。这速度不如别打了。我的魔女有其他赚钱的方法，不需要让她打怪啊。
啊，现在大洋到底 buff 了没？
可是他那个打怪打海怪就不知道到底行不行了。因为他打那个海怪， 感觉又变低啦。现在看那个 Gamos 的，
干都是他开红，然后我把他杀掉，我死都不开红，好爽。Gamos 改的很怪，
有点他的那个至少海怪啦，海怪现在不怎么高。
我要切腹继续刷了，杀爽了。干，我觉得双柱真的风险就是在另外柱有人，
真的那个真的很麻烦。
另外柱有人也不知道怎么办，因为有人会支持那种一人一柱说，你知道吗？
对啊，
嗯，
所以其实我有看到人，基本上我会让，
你会怎样？
我会让。
哦，对啊，大部分都都会让啊。
就是他如
应该
果问一下的话，他如果问一下我就会让了。那他如果直接来抢，我就跟你抢啊，我也没在怕啊。
他们大部分都会说啊，这个时间大家要赚钱不让一下，大家一起赚，好像
就想说，反正我多打那个也就多赚5000万，
嗯，
被闹的话可能少的更多，就算了。
就最近被大陆人搞很不爽，看到简体字有点想杀。
大陆人，
而且刚刚是两个人的两柱互相冲柱，这样就很
哇，
烦。
他打大剑还敢打2柱，我觉得大
他也
剑超难。
是打两柱啊，对啊，然后冲柱啊，嗯，
我超级讨厌打大剑。
冲柱就，掉红木，
哇，去搞把黑心来玩玩。
干，我好想搞一把。
来啊，要不要一起？我们可以一起打，如果你要那个的话。
现在在打白猫，
感觉可以哦。
白
那
猫，
我也来搞一把黑心木。
当
对啊
兵真的是一直在载手游。
不是啊，你那个我们可以一起打，你就不需要解那么麻烦了。最后一只网了，
都白猫的 buff 用完，
靠北白猫还有 buff 哦，
我一开完红回来就掉欧乐金腰带。
就是要献祭啊，
可是我现在没钱呢，
不用钱啊，为什么要钱？
不用钱吗？要买
对啊
王五，
要王五
买那个龟裂，
王五你没有吗？
是
龟裂现在很贵，龟裂现在很贵。
你去那个找3把就行了啊。去你之前在打完那几只身上随便搜一下都有3把吧。
这卖掉了，然后最近很久没掉，超难过。
哦，你很皮耶，你还卖掉？我干龟裂现在这么贵哦，我的仓库还有库存呢。
卖了吧？
因为
指定出大家都搞龟裂。
哦，你说我自己来点就好了。那你好了再叫我吧，我们可以一起打。省事啊
我也不知道我到底有没有钱搞。现在一个龟裂多少
2
，2
亿，
亿
？2亿是还可以接受。
，2亿加3个王五，大概你
6亿
要准备个5、6亿左右哦。
要6亿多吧？一个王五要1亿5，
我王五也变贵了。
要找到1亿出头的，要稍微找一下。
你找那个什么鸟王头那些的，
那个罗菲勒涨上去了没？
我看一下，帮你看一下。罗菲勒1亿
罗菲勒照理说最便宜，
，1亿，
对啊，最便宜。
我那天看到龟链很贵，我就把它卖掉了。
哦，连束甲都1亿了。
那个速价，
看连束甲都1亿，
输甲。
我最近都打不到箱子哎，最近都打不到网屋，
我也是，
好靠北
好难过。
最近打网什么都不掉。
啊，死掉了！
反正我先把前面做完了，做到要打网啊。如果你要打，你就跟我讲一下。
好，靠也这队友太狗屎了。
他的网是可以一起打，
应该是要打3次，就是
对，
我们3个人的话
我记。得就是互相帮忙，然后
对，
要打好几次，就队长才能打，我记得。对，这
有
个队长
点忘了，
招，
说不定可以啊，就跟我们之前那一只卡 bug 的卡莫斯一样。
感觉那个时候主线有办法，就不知道
不知道这个可不可以这样搞。诶，我上次和卢科豪一起有打过了，但我忘记我们2个是分开来招的，还是一起打的。
我也有帮那个吴镇宇打过，
可是我们是一起解，我们那时候是一起解，所以2个人都要打完。
不知道。
可是我有点忘记那个时候是一起打还是分开来招的。
对，黑龙4点出，你要不要来去追黑龙？
0，
真的
黑龙掉卡，
还会掉黑心，是不是？
没有死神盔甲，
是
他会掉死神盔甲，直接掉几百亿。
了。哎，4点那来不及。
4点
打班。
有，
啊，
我这边有。
卡马2有出，
好吧，那我去玩一下好了。既然我刚好都在这边了，那就去一下。
是我不要打谢尔汉，来去追黑龙，来去追我的卡普。
看你缺不缺这个钱的吧？
没有，你先加那个群组吧，你先看打怪群里，跟着大部队走，不然那个你打的那只黑龙可能会没人打。
哦，真的、哦。
嗯。
打怪
我不
群。
缺卡，我缺死神甲。
诶，是赫斯特利亚吗？
对，赫斯特利亚。
赫斯特利亚。
卡马3，艾3。
没有，他们在报，现在也在报哪几个伺服器吧。
露露飞一是有了。我看到一条红线。
一条很粗的。
他怎么没有人？
当然人不会那么快聚集，我都是先观察他们聚集在哪一个线打，然后再切去那个线，然后就开始跟着大部队打。
傻小，居然会没人，这只王也太可怜了吧！
没有他们的话，这个伺服器打完，然后再换另外一个伺服器打，这样。
哦，
因为人不够，
没看到有特别说要去哪一线的。
嗯，
感觉
球大
这最可怜的是
黑龙，可能那个吧，艾山可能会比较多人哦，因为现在有人在求大组，现在有人在问哪线开打。
对，我在看呢，但没有人鸟他哎。嘿嘿嘿，别去赫敦就好。
艾山开打90，那就去艾山。因为黑龙可以有好几次，有好几命。那我也想要来去打黑龙。
走啊，来啊，我也在啦。
啊，我这一支打完，我就切角去打黑龙。
拼个梦想啊！
对啊。
拼到
艾山打完再打黑龙，艾山目测15人，哦，那蛮多人。哦，用天马追是好追的。好玩出玩到最小号，为什么赫顿不去？会死，赫顿会碰到巨魔，是不是？哦，对，有卡佩赫顿呢，对，
笑死。
对他卡佩赫顿之后，黑龙位置还没改，是不是？他现在龟裂都改了，不知道你们有没有发现，龟裂都不会在怪区旁边。
哦，没注意耶。
我也没注意，我好久没打了。
我来煮你啊！
看这里有罗菲勒肯特诶。
啊？
罗菲勒肯特啊，那个称号。
哦，真的、哦？
凯子称号啊。
那是什么的称号？
就是不是罗菲勒之前不是有出时装吗？
啊，
就是你那个时装做出来就会有。
我知道你在说什么。看你们换一个伺服器。
那个真的是凯子称号啊。
那他不是有100亿？
没有，那要300亿。
300亿。
我记得啦，整件做出来要300亿，但是不知道是不是可以拿一个就有。
看，其实300亿现在的收入好像还可以，
但你要为了一个时装花300亿去搞它，
就是可能就是你觉得那是力量的展现的时候才可以，
真的。
因为300亿。
Okay, we're going to start with a warning.
Hello, and welcome back to Tectonic, a show in which we look at the way technology is changing our lives. I'm John Thornhill, Innovation Editor at the Financial Times in London. In this episode, we hear from the director of a new university research centre in London about the interface between academic research in machine learning and big tech companies.
People somehow think these tech giants are full of some special magic or something. These people don't grow on trees. They grow in universities by and large, right? So they are plucked out of the universities where they're overly busy with teaching, administration. It's crazy, right?
That was Professor David Barber, director of the UCL Centre for Artificial Intelligence. He came into the studio to talk to me about how academic researchers can work with business and the wider community to create the best outcomes for society. David, you've just been appointed director of the new UCL Centre for Artificial Intelligence. Can you tell us, how did the centre come about and what are you aiming to do?
Well, UCL's been quite active in AI and machine learning for many years. And I think we wanted to have a vehicle where we could actually show to the world what we're doing. So, about a year and a half ago, we had this idea of an AI center that would house all of our activities under AI, which had previously been a little bit siloed in different parts of the UCL, and bring them together under this one roof where we can bump into each other very easily, but also invite other people to come. We thought that was a really great opportunity. So we were very fortunate to have a building become free, or a floor in a building in Holborn. And now we have a lovely building there, kindly refurbished by UCL, and it's great.
Now, when I came to your launch event a few weeks ago, I was very struck by a number of the speakers talking about the multidisciplinary nature of what you're trying to do, and that AI didn't always used to be nestled in computer science departments in universities. It was often linked to the philosophy or psychology departments. Why has it been captured, as it were, by the computer science department, and do you think it does need a broader context?
Yes, it does. Historically, perhaps less so, partly because it's only within the last, say, 10 years or so that the applications of machine learning AI have become so pervasive that we're touching on aspects that affect all of us now. So there are ethical, sociological challenges and issues there to be addressed, which simply weren't there when you're just using these tools only in a research context. The sad truth is, or the interesting truth perhaps, is that we just don't know how to solve AI. Even now, these are all just hunches and guesses, and we're just going with whatever works. So there's still very much a role for people who, for example, in the neurosciences, psychology, etc., people who have other viewpoints on how natural intelligence might actually be functioning. So I think there's a very interesting interplay there and inspiration coming from those groups. In the early days of AI, when computation was not particularly powerful, it was important to have input from people who could look at the more logical sides of things, perhaps things which didn't require so much computation, or the more philosophical side of things. So I think right now, going forward, you cannot get away from the fact that you need interdisciplinarity in this area. It's simply inescapable that these tools are affecting all of us. And what does that mean? The answers to these questions are not mathematical in nature at all. So if you think about things like bias or fairness or ethics, it's not for us to decide what the correct solution would be, what would the correct measure, is it the greatest good for all or the individual or whatever it would be. We can implement whatever society, in quotes, asks us to do, but we're not the arbiters of the ethical considerations themselves. We will implement whatever people feel or deem is actually the right thing to do.
Now, you've been in this field a long time. Where do you personally think we're going to see the greatest impact of AI?
Well, I think certainly things like self-driving cars, that's going to be a major thing. I think that there are going to be some interesting applications in things like agriculture. Things which are already quite heavily automated will become increasingly so. I think automation in agriculture will be enormous. Not necessarily in the way that one may think, in the sense of traditional farming, but maybe much more localized, intensive farming close to city centers, which would be automated within perhaps big factories. And
These are kind of vertical farms you're talking
yeah,
about.
things like that. But the automation of the farming there, I think that could be potentially a very interesting thing, or maybe a very close connection with the supermarkets. But I think that supply of food will probably be a big impact. I think also the delivery of goods will be another big thing. Currently, we are very used to people delivering things for us. I think it's quite natural to think that quite soon that will be automated either through things like drones or some form of physical walking robot that might actually come to your house bringing various goods to you. Although it's hard to do, actually, quite frankly, like interacting in the physical world with robots. It sounds maybe quite easy compared to some other apparently difficult AI tasks like game playing, like chess or something like that. But actually, robotics is pretty complex compared to game playing.
Now, you're partnering, as you were mentioning, with some quite big industrial partners, some of the big tech firms. Do you think universities can remain at the leading edge of AI, or is it the private companies that have vast amounts of data, huge amounts of cash and computing power who really are going to do all the running in this field?
Well, I think that universities are at the moment still highly relevant. A lot of the research which comes out of the universities is still very, very high quality, but perhaps the kinds of research that they are doing is a little bit different. So it's true that it's very challenging now for a university to do some of the kinds of research that the industry giants are able to do, and which is very relevant sometimes for consumers. So, for example, if you want to make a next generation speech recognition system, that may require data resources, computational resources, which are not addressable in a standard university environment. But the people are the same, right? So it's worth bearing in mind that the people that are working in the tech giants largely are the same people that were working, or perhaps even currently work, in academia as well. So people actually are sometimes part-time in university or part-time in industry. So I think there is a very good chance that the universities will continue to play a very leading role, particularly when you think that we're still a very long way away, in my opinion, from where we'd really like to be in terms of AI. And to get to that next stage, that won't necessarily just require throwing more money in terms of computation and data. It requires some creative thinking, perhaps in an interdisciplinary sense, as we mentioned before.
But do you think it's a good thing that there is a free flow of academics and researchers between universities and private companies, or is there a danger that universities just become captured by big tech? In fact, we've seen in Carnegie Mellon University in America, their whole robotics department was basically bought out by Uber. Is there a danger we're just stripping away the expertise from a public sector?
Yes, there is. That's happened already in the UK. I would say, a good fraction of our leading researchers and academics have actually already been scooped up by the tech giants. It depends a little bit on your viewpoint, right? So you could say, look, that's a success story. Some people might say that's the natural progression of research. Once it's taken up by industry, academia has played its role, and it's over to industry to take that forwards. But there's another viewpoint of this, which is that actually most of the key developments which are required to be made shouldn't be kept in the hands of a small number of very powerful companies. And the universities should be playing a good role still to democratize, if you like, these technologies. And I think it's a little bit of both. The thing that's interesting about the industry versus academia is not necessarily only just about the money or the sort of concerns about where the power is concentrating, but it's an interesting point about how does the research actually get done? What is the aim of the research? So if you've got a project or problem that you really, really care strongly about, and how are you going to solve that? Let's take an example like the Manhattan Project. Now, how are you going to build a bomb, right? An atom bomb. Are you going to take that money and you're going to scatter it across a whole bunch of researchers and hope that one or two of them, these lone geniuses sitting there in their offices with one or two PhD students, might hit on something which will solve the problem? That's one approach. Another approach is to concentrate your resources into a single place and put everybody together and encourage them to actually solve that problem. Now, if you really, really, really care about something, then probably the Manhattan sort of concentration style idea is the right way to go. But the universities are much more on the sort of scattering of the funding, at least historically. So it is a question of resources to some extent, but it's also a question of attitude and how to focus and use those resources wisely. And my feeling is that it's not just the UK, but the way that university research is funded is a kind of broken system.
What way is it broken?
Well, I mean, just look at, say, the tech giants. They come and they take our brightest academics. People somehow think these tech giants that are full of some special magic or something. These people don't grow on trees. They grow in universities by and large, right? So they are plucked out of the universities where they're overly busy with teaching, administration. It's crazy, right? The greatest academics we have in this country are incapable of really addressing the greatest challenges the country face in terms of research in the future because they're simply not able to do the job that they actually have spent perhaps the last 20, 30 years of their life trying to train for. But, the universities are so cash-strapped and they're also all about teaching, it's all about administration. The job has changed so dramatically in academia the last 20-odd years that when they're offered a chance to go and work in, say, some tech giant, it's not just the money there, but it's actually the opportunity to finally crack on with a team of like-minded, talented people to actually address some of these very interesting problems. So that's really a funding issue in the sense that the funding is not used wisely at the moment. So I think I'd like to see a more concentrated effort of the research funding.
There's also a kind of massive differential in pay, as you're alluding to, between the university and the private sector as well, isn't there? I mean, Google and DeepMind are just along the road from you at UCL, but they've been scooping up a lot of academics, kind of 5 times the pay of the Prime Minister. That's quite a big differential.
It is, but I don't think it's the only reason that people go to work there. What I was suggesting before is that academics, by and large, they don't go into academia because they want to make money. It's a long training process. The typical mindset of an academic is They like their independence, they like their freedom. Most of them are very passionate about what they're doing. If they wanted to make money, they would have done something else, many, many years ago. But the sad reality is that many of them in academia at the moment don't have the time to do what they would really like to do. They perhaps don't have quite enough money to live the lifestyle they would hope to have. So when they're offered the opportunity to be free from that and then go and work in industry, if it's a very interesting research lab, that's good. But I have to say that I don't think it's necessarily the ideal solution for many academics. I think one would have to ask them, but my suspicion is that many of them would prefer to actually stay in academia because at their core, they love independence. And if you go and work even for a cool tech giant, you're still told what to do. You're not a totally free person who can just think of anything you want to do. You have to do what your project manager is asking you to do.
Now, in your part of North London, there's an extraordinary mixture of different institutions and companies emerging. You've got UCL, you've got DeepMind, you have the Francis Crick Institute, you have the whole British Library and the Alan Turing Institute, which is housed near there. You've got a whole bunch of VCs, you've got a whole bunch of startups. Some people have said that this is the Palo Alto of Europe. We're going to get this great knowledge quarter developing. Do you think that's right?
I don't know if it's a Palo Alto, but it's great. It's very, very exciting. At UCL, we also have some interest in the Knowledge Quarter. I'm not sure what I'm allowed to say about it, but that's certainly of great interest to us. I think we view the King's Cross Knowledge Quarter as a major opportunity, not just for UCL, but for the UK generally. And I think it is a very exciting area. It's no coincidence that all of the tech giants are circling around that area. And I think it's a very exciting place, both in terms of the concentration of interest there, but the diversity of them as well. And as you mentioned, the Crick Institute is very, very exciting. The Turing Institute is also super exciting. So I think that what I'd like to see more of, though, is innovation. I don't want just to think about the corporates, sort of, and the tech giants and, the big research groups. But what we need more of in the UK is the innovation from the startup level, getting to the point that it doesn't just become like a 20, 30 person company and get acquired by one of the tech giants, but actually it's able to stand on its own 2 feet and become a much more significant player in industry. So maybe some ideal perspective would be some institutions like UCL foster startup companies and spin-outs, but they actually are established through perhaps places like the Knowledge Quarter and more organically grow to some significant size that actually, they're just not going to get acquired so easily.
And is that scale-up infrastructure in place now, do you think? I mean, for a
No.
long time, people have talked about Europe lacking that scale-up.
No, it's not there. I think there are great challenges about that. I mean, obviously, one of the major issues is market size, right? If you're a small startup, and you look at the addressable market that you have, of course, the US is much, much bigger. So it's quite natural that they get acquired by US tech giants. But I think Europe is trying to fight this a little bit. There are initiatives out there to try to make a more European-wide research network, which will also hopefully help with innovation as well. It's hard to say, but I'm cautiously optimistic that we will be able to do a little bit more in Europe in that sense. But that would require some more integration of thought and leadership actually across Europe to achieve that.
And the European Union is putting, about 100 billion euros into their Horizon Europe project over the next 7 years. And a lot of that focus is on startups, innovation, AI, deep tech. Are we now going to be chopped off from that in Britain?
Not sure. I don't know, to be honest, the details of those agreements. But I should say one thing about that. You might think that it's kind of a shame if we were cut off from some of those sorts of funding. So historically, actually for us in the machine learning AI area, we've not looked particularly to the European Union for funding. And the European Union for funding, in our area at least, in some sense, it was more, from my viewpoint, a sort of a project to ensure European harmony. For example, a typical European Union project would have been something like, let's say, we're going to build some digital assistant. That might be a call for something like that. And of course, then a digital assistant will need some brains for it. So you might say you need the speech recognition, you might need some visual object recognition, you might need some, even a physical thing, if this is some kind of little robot that might be walking around the room. And typically then the Germans might do the speech recognition, the Brits might do the image recognition, the Spanish, something else. But it was always very much with a view to scattering again the resources and ensuring that there was a collaboration effect across Europe. typically very little integration of those separate components ever actually occurred. There are very few instances where you could actually go, you see, that's the digital assistant that we said we were going to build. So they have these a little bit strange frameworks where they have these calls for building these things, all the money scattered, but they never actually build this thing. So for us, I don't think there were too many tears shed when we thought, well, we may be losing funding from the European Union for at least some of the AI activities. I mean, there's some very good things in terms of networking, but in terms of the research projects, in terms of identifying a specific thing to do on the research, I don't feel it was working particularly well for us. So I think it goes back to a little bit the point before, if you are going to use these resources, the question is how to use them and how to use them wisely. So I'd like to think that the European Union will actually think a little bit more carefully about how to actually maybe concentrate these resources in some slightly more meaningful way and perhaps be less concerned so much about it as an exercise in European harmonization.
Now, a lot of the excitement about AI recently has been as a result of deep learning techniques, and there is something of a growing backlash against that now, saying that maybe this is not the miracle solution that some people had previously imagined. And I was reading a very interesting interview in Wired with Jerome Pesenti, who's Facebook's head of AI, who's actually previously, I think, worked at Benevolent AI around the corner from UCL. And he said this: deep learning and current AI, if you are really honest, has a lot of limitations. We are very, very far from human intelligence, and there are some criticisms that are valid. It can propagate human biases, it's not easy to explain, it doesn't have common sense, it's more on the level of pattern matching than robust semantic understanding. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much. I think that it's true, but I would say that's current deep learning, right? So it depends a little bit on your viewpoint as well. So some people would say, well, look, a human brain is in some sense a kind of deep learning style device, right? It's not based upon a traditional computational device, and yet it manages to do many of the kinds of things that Jerome would like it to do. So some people would take that viewpoint and say, well, is the question more of how to manipulate, if you like, the sort of deep learning style systems to do the kinds of things that we would like it to do better, like having a deeper understanding of the world around it, a deeper understanding of text, etc. But it should be possible because, look, see, brains can do it. So that's one argument in favor of that approach. But I think that it doesn't necessarily mean it's the most efficient way to do it. So if you think about some of the kinds of things that we would like to do, perhaps having more explanation around predictions of these systems, more knowledge about how the world around us works. It may be possible to do it within a deep learning system, but it may be quite hard to do it that way. So definitely there is increasing interest in how to interface the kinds of knowledges that we think we need the system to have access to with maybe some deeper reasoning systems like maybe the deep learning system. And still we don't really know how to do that, right? So it's a very exciting and interesting research area in itself. So if you think currently about the technologies you might have on your smartphone, many of which are actually deep learning systems, when you think about, for example, translation, it's quite remarkable, really, that they're able to do this without access to the kinds of deep knowledge and understanding that we have access to. So perhaps when we read that paragraph in English and we try to translate it into, say, French, we might comprehend that sentence and that paragraph as what the objects are, who's doing what with them, etc., and then make a corresponding version of that in the French language, a version based upon an actual understanding of what's going on in that paragraph of text. But the way it works in deep learning and current translation systems is far from that. Really, it's just a very superficial thing. They're looking almost at, you take each word in the English sentence and you have some perhaps 4 or 5 correlates in French, and you then just try to rearrange those correlates in French in the most grammatically likely structure, and more often than not, that seems to work. It's a useful tool to have. I'm not knocking it, it's great, but it's not where we want to be in AI. We would like to have systems which are actually able to read text, comprehend what's going on, make summarizations for us, make linkages with reading vast amounts of text, things that we simply could not do at scale ourselves. And that's the kind of systems that we would like to have. Also, if you think about digital assistants, you want the assistant to ultimately have a much deeper understanding of you. What is your environment? What are you talking about? Your family members, your dog's name, the fact that Bobby isn't a friend, but it's your family dog or whatever it is. There needs to be persistence of this knowledge. So all of these things are very, very important to integrate into the AI systems in some way, and how to do that is still very much an open research question. But I think it's also fair to say that different kinds of intelligence out there. So maybe the psychologists might say, typically there might be 2 kinds of fast and slow thinking in many reasoning systems, where the perceptual, which might be the fast thing, maybe you would just recognize the snake, for example. That's not necessarily a kind of a reasoning style system. You just have an instant pattern recognition. But on the other hand, if I ask you to figure out how to get from St. Paul's to High Holborn the quickest way, you'd have to sort of have maybe some mental map about how to do that. You'd have to sort of think about it, have a model perhaps in your mind, and go through the options and have some deeper reasoning about it. So then the question is, you could say, well, that pattern matching of the snake is the kind of thing that deep learning can do very well at the moment. Those reasoning kinds of planning kinds of problems are things that perhaps in principle could be done by deep learning systems, but perhaps a little bit clunky to do at the moment. But it's certainly clear that we need both of those kinds of reasonings, and whether or not they're all achievable under the same technical umbrella of deep learning is less clear. But I think we don't mind so much. I mean, I should say as well that the community of AI, certainly machine learning, is very, very pragmatic. We will go with whatever works. We are not ideologists in the sense that, this thing has got to be deep learning or it's got to be something else. We will use whatever works and take it to the max in that sense.
So that implies in a way that maybe some of the old techniques of good old-fashioned AI, semantic understanding and symbolic logic and so on, they're going to be revived, are they, and almost merged with the deep learning techniques to provide enhanced AI?
Yes, they are. People do that already. The way that it's often working at the moment is that people are trying to endow deep learning systems with some simple logical reasoning capabilities. So, for example, they might be asked to do arithmetic, or perhaps given one sentence, does this other sentence actually logically follow from that first sentence? So, all those things are currently there. It seems to be the case that you can endow systems with some forms of logic. My own feeling is that the bottleneck is partly there, but the biggest bottleneck is actually getting access to the knowledge itself. So if you think about humans, I mean, we're very impressed with kids, right? They're able to run around and interact in the environment and do fun things, but you're not going to ask a kid to solve some science problem because they just don't have access to the knowledge yet that they need to be able to do that. It takes them years to develop not just the knowledge, but maybe the ways of thinking that will be required to actually do scientific research. Now, similarly, it's a big ask of AI systems that don't have access to the knowledge that's potentially required to do those kinds of things. So I think I see that more as the challenge, just getting that either knowledge embedded within the AI system, or at least that it has access to that knowledge. Maybe it's an interface to databases where it can query them perhaps and then use those results of the query back to update its understanding of the world. But those are the kinds of things people are currently very, very much working heavily on. And I think that's a great prize. So I think when people talk about deep learning research, there are many, many avenues to go down. But for me, the most exciting one is that I would really like to see people figuring out and focusing much more on how to get that access to that knowledge that's required to make the deep learning systems or the AI systems work much more efficiently and effectively for us.
Now, for better or worse, a lot of people are saying that the world is now divided into three camps, as it were, of AI. You've got the US system, you've got the Chinese system, and you've got the European system, which all have very different sensibilities and focuses and priorities. I'd like to ask a bit about China. Kai-Fu Lee has talked in his book AI Superpowers about how China is leading the world in the application of AI. Is that right, do you think? And is there a danger that Europe just gets left behind in this world of AI superpowers?
Certainly, China's doing very, very well. From the research perspective, the volume of output is very high. I think that the overall quality is probably not as good as some of the European and the US labs. But I think, yes, in terms of application, China's racing ahead. And it's not just in AI, it's across a whole range of sectors. So if you think about things like payment systems. Even in Europe now, we don't necessarily fully trust credit cards. When you go to Germany, maybe people like to pay cash in some places still. This is crazy in China. People don't even use credit cards anymore. Everything's on your phone. Perhaps quite soon you won't even use that. You just pay with your face, right? You just present your face and everything's paid automatically. So I think it's more about the reception of technology in China. And there are very interesting cultural distinctions there. So there's a combination of project programming in some sense, where the governments will say, we have a definite target that China will become the leading AI superpower by 2030. That's a specified aim, and they'll put whatever resources in they need to try to achieve that. So that's one element of this. Another element is that Chinese society itself is relatively much more receptive to the introduction of new technologies than we are in the West. That has huge consequences in terms of not just the economics, if you like, but also the abilities to actually do this. So healthcare, for example, you could say, well, everybody would recognize to some extent there are great opportunities within healthcare if you could get hold of this data to make a much better diagnostic system. But actually getting hold of the data is extremely challenging, particularly in the West, because perhaps quite rightly, there's a focus on the individual's privacy, etc. This is very, very important. But I think what we often forget or miss out on when people talk about things like responsible innovation is very much on the individual. We have to protect the individual's rights and freedoms. But we also have a responsibility as scientists to make things which help society. So we could make much better healthcare systems. We can make diagnostic treatments, provided we can get maybe access to this data. And that may require some shift in understanding what's best for the individual versus what's best for society. And I think currently our thinking on that spectrum from individual to communal is very, very much on the individual in the West, and it's a little bit more on the communal in the East. And I think that's also part of the story as to why China is much more receptive to these technologies, because they're looking at the collective benefits of some of these technologies. So, of course, there are concerns as well, but it's very great to be able to have systems which are self-driving cars, pooling data to do maybe face recognition, maybe has some positive things like in payment systems. Of course, there are concerns in China that they're perhaps racing away with the communal benefits, but perhaps taking their eye off some of the individual challenges around freedom. So I think for us in the West, the challenge is how to retain the kinds of things that we hold very dear about the freedoms, but actually not throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, we're just going to discard the idea of pooling data because it's a worry and not having any of the potential benefits from being able to do that.
Well, I'm very glad that your centre is now there to thresh out all of these issues. But this is what you're going to be focusing on, is it very much?
Yeah, so as typical in universities, there's 3 strands. There's research, there's innovation, and there's teaching. So UCL is done very well in teaching. We are graduating a very large number of students every year in AI, particularly in the master's program. So I think we're quite a big beast in the UK in that sense.
How many students graduate?
Around 150 each year in the broad area of AI from students all around the world. Actually, a lot from China, around 30 to 35% graduates from China. Many of those students also come from Europe, mainland Europe. So the UK and London in particular has done very, very well. We're kind of like not necessarily Palo Alto, but maybe the Silicon Valley London is of Europe, and it attracts a lot of very talented students, some of which go back to Europe, but also a large number of which remain here and form startup companies. So my own students, actually, many of them come from Europe, have stayed here, contribute enormously to the UK society and economy by making startups and spin-outs from the universities, and that's enormously important to try to keep hold of that in this Brexit environment. These things are all linked up. So those 3 strands that I mentioned in research, teaching, and innovation, they're not independent, isolated pillars. Students come to get good teaching and training or whatever, but then they perhaps graduate and they do PhD programs and they're doing their research, and then they graduate and they go into innovation. And certainly we are absolutely compelled to do really well in all of those. I think the AI Centre is at UCL. We're very fortunate to be in this lovely building right in the centre of London, very close to a large number of other very exciting organisations. But also we have a great innovation culture here in London, and we want to support that. It's not for the aggrandizement of UCL, it's a national resource that we want to use to benefit the UK economy and society more generally. So we very much see the AI Centre as part of the solution, if you like, and as part of the network of opportunities within London. We're very collaborative, we're very open. There'll be a whole range of events that we're hoping to host starting from next year. There'll be events related to how AI and art actually can play an interesting synergy together. There'll be opportunities for the public to come and discuss ethical issues about AI, come to look at actually what we're doing in terms of research. So yeah, we're open for business.
Well, it's going to be fascinating to see how your centre develops, but thank you very much, David.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening. We're taking a short break, but we will be back in the new year with more interviews where we will explore the way technology is changing our lives. In the meantime, please keep sending in your comments and suggestions. We love to hear from our listeners, so please email us at tectonic@ft.com and do rate and review us on your chosen podcast app as well, so that other listeners can find us. Tectonic is produced by Fiona Simon. What should we make of a world where we spend more time online than we do offline? I'm John Thornhill, host of Tectonic, the podcast from the Financial Times that investigates the promises and perils of our digital age. This season, cutting-edge technology is solving many of the problems we're dealing with right now.
I think what the pandemic has revealed is that there's probably an opportunity to take patient monitoring to a whole nother level.
But it's also intensified our use of digital technology, bringing us to a new frontier.
Well, I do think that this is as big as electricity and the steam machine.
You can find Tectonic on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Seconds and counting.
July the 16th, 1969.
Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 25 seconds.
3 men are huddled together in a space not much bigger than the inside of a car.
20 seconds and counting.
They are about to be hurled into outer space, traveling faster than the speed of sound to pull away from Earth's gravitational field.
10, 9, ignition sequence start.
And into the vacuum of space on a 238,000-mile journey to the moon.
1, 0, all engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
The computing power behind that mission makes its success seem all the more remarkable today.
Forward. 40 feet down, 2.5. 4 forward.
The chip technology used in the Apollo guidance computer had been developed by a company called Fairchild Semiconductors.
On the air base in South Vietnam, we successfully put into orbit.
in an area of California that by the end of the 1960s would come to be known as Silicon Valley. 4 years before that historic first moon landing, Fairchild's Director of Research and Development, a 36-year-old engineer named Gordon Moore, published an important paper. In it, Moore observed that the number of transistors packed onto a computer chip doubled every year, from a single transistor in 1959 to about 60 by the middle of the next decade. Here he is speaking in 2005.
So I just took that doubling every year and extrapolated from 60 to 60,000 components for the next 10 years. And so that's what's going to happen. It's going to make cheaper electronics.
Though Moore later revised his calculations from 1 to 2 years, his theory has held true to the present day. This law, Moore's law as it has become known, explains an exponential increase in computing power and has massively accelerated our use of technology. The Apollo guidance computer, which helped Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin land on the moon, contained just over 16,000 transistors. These miniature components, which switch and amplify electronic signals, have become the message carriers of our modern age.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
16,000 transistors. An iPhone 12 contains 11.8 billion. That's almost 1 million times more powerful than the Apollo guidance computer. It only took a few decades to get from pioneering chips to cheap electronics, just as Moore had predicted.
Why did you buy a computer?
Well, I was very interested in the new technology and didn't want to be left behind.
It's wild what's going on. You can send electronic mail to people.
Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone.
The COVID-19 pandemic has intensified our use of digital technology. What are the promises and dangers of this new tech-driven age? This is Tectonic. I'm John Thornhill, Innovation Editor at the Financial Times. We have reimagined this podcast as a multi-part series exploring the big ideas driving innovation. This season, we're looking at how the pandemic has speeded up the transition to an online world. It may feel like we're sitting still, but we are living through an age of acceleration. Doctors have rapidly adopted telemedicine, while patients have been using wearable devices. School children have been taught in digital classrooms, and billions of us have communicated, shopped, worked, and been entertained mostly online. Our use of big data and powerful computing has also enabled us to develop a coronavirus vaccine at record speed. But do you or I own our own data in any meaningful sense? And who says how it can be used? I'll be investigating these big themes along with a team of FT reporters and other experts across continents, looking at different sectors which are run by data.
I think what the pandemic has revealed is that there's probably an opportunity to take patient monitoring to a whole nother level.
There's no way that universities can come near to satisfying demand in the market. Universities do a great job in educating the whole human. They are not set up for dealing with rapid societal change.
If an entrepreneur wants to start a business that is in any way challenging one of those domains, they basically just can't get funded. They're called kill zones.
They can access your credit card data, and they can use CCTV footage from wherever they want to locate and track people.
We now hold the ability to do so much in the palm of our hands. The rising power, falling cost, and increased energy efficiency of computers over the past 50 years means that 3.5 billion people, half the population of the world, own a smartphone with instantaneous access to the internet. Our lives are increasingly moving from the offline to the online world, to the point of becoming almost indistinguishable from each other. When I talked last year with William Gibson, the science fiction writer who coined the term cyberspace, he suggested that we might be the last generation to draw any distinction between our physical and virtual lives. During the pandemic, our devices have kept us connected to the outside world, mobilizing people to campaign for social justice and equality. That connectivity has also provided us with moments of great joy.
I'm here live. I'm not a cat.
And banality too.
I think you need to unmute Ian. Can we get Ian's audio?
Every minute of every day, we collectively send 190 million emails, 59 million messages, and 19 million texts. We conduct 4.1 million Google searches and swipe 1.6 million times on Tinder. But most of that data automatically comes from our connected devices, pinging out locations, financial transfers, messages, and sensor readings to the Internet of Things. All of that data has provided the fuel for a new generation of powerful machine learning models used by the Googles, Amazons, and the Alibabas of this world that have boosted the economic and political power of big tech. We are entering the age of the algorithm, in which decisions are made both by humans and machines.
Well, I do think that this is as big as electricity and the steam machine.
That's Margrethe Vestager, the European Union's Competition Commissioner. It's her job to ensure that fair standards of competition are complied with in Europe's digital marketplace.
If this had happened 10 years ago, so many things would not have been possible. To maintain working, schooling, shopping, exercising for that matter, and also fighting the virus in itself has been accelerated by the use of technology. And now we see it, of course, in every sector, in every industry, that digitization is moving on. These are fundamental changes in how we produce, in how we live, in how we work, in how we interact with one another. This is one of the things that really changes a society on a very fundamental level.
Our increased generation of data through the use of digital tech has boosted the big tech companies whose revenues and share prices have grown dramatically during the pandemic. This is the case at Microsoft, where the shift to working from home has increased demand for its company's cloud computing and other software services. For Chief Executive Satya Nadella, the pandemic has brought about a new digital era.
We've all woken up collectively, including the tech industry, to say, wow, we do have at least this malleable resource in software and digital tech that does allow us not only to transform and pivot fast to new circumstances, but also gives us resilience. So these two words, transformation and resilience through digital tech, have sort of been, I think, the big awakening.
Nadella believes the pandemic has fundamentally changed the way we use and view digital technology.
There's no going back in the sense that the digital technology is going to be very much part of our economies, part of our lives, part of our society.
The big question is why we should trust an AI bot as much as a nurse or a doctor when we do not know who has written its operating instructions.
Given the inevitability of digital tech playing much more of a central role, we need to build more trust in this technology. Same thing with AI and ethics, or privacy, or internet safety. These are all big issues that erode trust in technology.
We do not want big tech to control all our data, nor do we want big government to do so either. We need to develop trustworthy institutions that give users confidence that our data is being managed appropriately and safely. As the FT's innovation editor, I try to keep track of how technology is changing our world, and I'm constantly astonished by the collective power of human ingenuity. Our ability to collate vast sums of data and devise predictive models can change the way we tackle real-world challenges such as food insecurity, a problem that the pandemic has exacerbated, even in the world's richest country.
A wave of hunger is expected to hit Minnesota families over the next 6 months. Job losses brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic are fueling the surge in hunger.
When the pandemic first began, there was almost an immediate change in the amount of food that our agency partners were requesting from us as a result of that. So within a couple of weeks, maybe even just a week, we saw an initial spike that made us kind of pause and think we might be facing something that we hadn't faced before in our recent history.
That's Julie Van Hove. She's the Director of Demand and Supply Planning at Minnesota's largest food bank, Second Harvest Heartland. Between March and April, Minnesota's unemployment rate jumped from just under 3% to 8%, and applications for unemployment insurance reached almost 700,000. During the same period, the food bank noted a sharp increase in demand for food from the counties it supplied.
We needed some different tools in our toolbox to make sure that we had enough food to meet the demand that we might face. But the big question mark was, well, what might that demand look like?
To predict demand for food, Julie and her team asked consultancy firm McKinsey to devise a database model. This model used unemployment data from the counties in Minnesota and Wisconsin, where the food bank operates, along with national data on food insecurity.
So we were able to approach donors to say, here's the number of meals that we're going to need to provide in our community. And honestly, we were bringing in 15 or 20 truckloads a week of purchased product to be able to fill the need, not only in the moment, but knowing that we had a need, month over month for the next several months. If we had not had this data model, we would have been in scramble mode.
The more virtuous uses of data are only a part of the story. There are also serious dangers in the misuse of mass online communication. Some governments have resorted to so-called computational propaganda, indirectly exploiting social media data to target disinformation campaigns against foreign citizens. Facebook has acknowledged that its services were misused by some of its 18 million users in Myanmar to incite hatred and physical violence against the minority Rohingya population. Thousands of Rohingya were killed in the violence as 700,000 people fled to Bangladesh. As these cases have shown, our data is highly valuable, and the need to build trust around how our personal information is used and stored has never been greater.
We live in a time of identity politics. of, really strong clashes, trying to understand who we are, how we interact with others. Data is an integrated part of that.
That's Margrethe Vestager again.
And we are in the marketplace, and we are in our democracies, and our data is part of what defines us. So getting in control of your data becomes obviously increasingly important as we leave more and more data traces.
Some economists have suggested that data is replacing price as the most important information signal in the economy. Price used to be the best information capsule, containing what someone is willing to sell something for and what someone is prepared to pay for it. But data is a lot richer. As an information capsule, it can contain where you live, how wealthy you are, what premium you are prepared to pay for speed of delivery, the emotional state you're in, or when you're most susceptible to buying.
The problem, of course, that data and price have a different history. We have a sense of what is a fair price, what is reasonable, compared to what we paid before, what our neighbors paid. When it comes to data, it's much more difficult. You have a sense of how much should I work in order to pay this. You have no sense of how much data should I pay for this service in order for this payment to be fair. And that, of course, puts the consumer in a very, very difficult position when it comes to assessing what is the real price that I'm paying here. What I see is the risk of markets closing in, more and more gatekeepers sort of deciding what are the rules in their markets and not always encouraging fair competition.
I mean, all of this technology was supposed to give us more free time, right? It was supposed to save us time and make things more convenient.
That's Tim Bradshaw, the FT's global tech correspondent based in London.
But even when your groceries can be delivered by Uber or Deliveroo in an hour, I still haven't really figured out where that extra time is going. It certainly doesn't feel like I've got more free time to relax.
So, Tim, in what ways do you think the pandemic has changed the way that we use technology?
I think the main difference is that we've all been forced to use more of it all of the time. And that includes those who maybe weren't quite such enthusiastic early adopters and were not digital natives, but we've all been forced to learn over the last year how to communicate online, work online, shop online, entertain ourselves, and those will, I think, create habits that last for much longer, even after these lockdowns lift.
A lot of people are worried about the way that this data economy is evolving. Do you think there is a technological solution to this technological problem, as it were? There are a lot of people who are focusing on privacy by design. You're seeing big tech companies talking about the end of the era of the cookie, these kind of tracking cookies that follow us around the internet. And there's been a big kind of standoff between Apple and Facebook over privacy as well. Do you think this increasing competition is going to improve data protection for ordinary consumers?
I think there's definitely scope for it to improve data protection for some consumers. I think the risk of the tension between Apple and Facebook, for instance, is that you end up with people who can afford to pay for privacy and people who can't, and are therefore stuck using free services that just endlessly gobble up more information about them for advertising to fund it. And there are pluses and minuses to both of those. I mean, there is an argument which Facebook makes that, and indeed some news publishers make, that information should be free so that everyone can access it, and that means that ultimately kind of helps democracy at some higher level. But it equally, we've seen some of the side effects of that in elections over the last few years. So it's not at all a one-way street. I think what Apple's doing by forcing app developers to be more transparent in how they're using customer data and to kind of rein in how they can share it between apps is broadly a positive thing. But Apple's products, by and large, is quite expensive. And so it does make me sort of feel like that it would be great if there was another third path found through that. I just haven't quite seen anyone strike it yet.
It's all too easy to think of data as just a series of dry numbers in a database somewhere. But as we are beginning to see, data can be used to wield economic and political power, to shape cultural and societal values, to define us as communities and as individuals. Computing power has been growing at an exponential rate over the past few decades. If Moore's law continues, it will open up even more technological possibilities in the future. Researchers at companies such as Neuralink are even exploring how to implant tiny electrodes into our heads to act as brain-computer interfaces. We may think that a good idea when trying to improve treatment for Parkinson's disease, but it doesn't take long to imagine far scarier scenarios. Technology, as the saying goes, is neither positive nor negative, but nor is it neutral. We must guard against the risks of the data economy running out of control, and we should become wise enough to direct it to our ends. Next time on Tectonic, could a piece of high-tech clothing help emergency room doctors better care for COVID patients? The COVID-19 pandemic has put our healthcare systems under extreme strain, but it has also accelerated the debate about how data can best be used to improve them.
I think what the pandemic has revealed is that there's probably an opportunity to take patient monitoring to a whole nother level than we had ever previously considered.
You've been listening to Tectonic from the Financial Times in London with me, John Thornhill. This episode was produced by Liam Nolan. Sound design was by Breen Turner and Louise Burton, with additional production by Oluwakemi Aladasui. The editor was Amy Keane, and our executive producer, Cheryl Brumley. Original music was composed by Metaphor Music.
The lungs in the worst COVID patients will sound, for lack of a more technical term, junky. It just sounds like there's stuff in there and the air is not moving around. You hear sounds that can be higher pitched, or there are sounds we describe as crackling and things popping, and sort of parts of the lung opening up as somebody takes a deep breath and then collapsing back down as somebody exhales. In a normal lung, you don't hear those kinds of things.
Dr. John Marshall heads up the emergency room at a busy hospital in Brooklyn, the Maimonides Medical Center. In the spring of 2020, John had a storm on his hands.
At the peak of the COVID epidemic, we had nearly 500 patients admitted with COVID, and I think we maxed out at 170 or so patients on ventilators. And it really did feel like a tidal wave.
John is 51. He's been a physician for more than 2 decades and was previously an Air Force doctor who served in Afghanistan.
Hey, it's John. I know I haven't been over there. I'm about to start something else here, but is everything okay with those patients?
And I'm working on the discharge with the other guy.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. All right, call me if you need anything, all right? Bye.
Maimonides treated over 10,000 COVID patients in the first 6 months of the pandemic.
We really converted almost every space we had inside into a hospital space for COVID patients. You know, we took one of our labor and delivery floors and turned that into a COVID unit. We took our surgical wards and turned those into the COVID unit.
John and his colleagues soon realized something. Patients who had tested positive for the new virus needed a lot more monitoring than patients with pneumonia or straightforward flu.
You know, when this first happened for a lot of hospitals, I think folks didn't realize what degree of monitoring even the hospitalized patients needed to avoid the precipitous decline we would see in some of these COVID patients. What the pandemic has revealed is that there's probably an opportunity to take patient monitoring to a whole nother level than we had ever previously considered.
You're listening to Tectonic. I'm John Thornhill, Innovation Editor at the Financial Times, and your host for the series. This season, we're exploring how the pandemic is accelerating the transition to a datafied world and changing so many aspects of our lives. This week, we're looking at wearable devices. Around 1 in 5 Americans now wear one, and the global wearables market is estimated to be worth more than $80 billion. It's not all about Apple Watches and Fitbits, though. There's a lot of interesting work taking place in the area of clinical-grade wearables, too. The need for social distancing during the pandemic has made many healthcare professionals begin to rethink how to monitor patients. And clinical-grade wearables are at the forefront of these experiments. So how likely is it that these devices could become the diagnostic tools of the future? And what does that mean for healthcare systems? Hannah Kuchler, the FT's pharma and biotech correspondent, has been covering the pandemic from New York, and she picks up the story from here.
So I used to be based in Silicon Valley for 5.5 years, and when I moved to start covering healthcare a couple of years ago, I was fascinated with how technology was going to disrupt healthcare, and in particular wearables, because for a long time they've been seen as these kind of annoying step counters, for fitness fanatics. But we're just on the edge, I felt, of them being able to capture really useful data that could actually be used by healthcare systems. In Brooklyn's Maimonides Hospital, John Marshall is trying something new.
Do I hit record, by the way, now or no? You can hear the ambulances in the background right there, probably.
He had a clear problem to solve. COVID patients need intense monitoring.
Patients never really like blood pressure cuffs going off every 15 minutes. Having stickers on the chest wall that can certainly be very uncomfortable when they get pulled off. Being attached to wires that prevent them from getting up and moving around the room.
So in September, John and the other senior staff began asking patients who had tested positive for COVID-19 to participate in a trial. It was a requirement that the patients didn't display antibodies to the virus. Volunteers were asked to wear this cloth-based device which fitted over their shoulder during their stay at the hospital. For some, that could just be 2 days, and others it was up to 28 days. The garment that they're using is called the SimpleSense. It was developed by a New York company called NanoAir, and it was actually originally designed to monitor patients with congestive heart failure.
Having something that's close to the patient's skin, that can transmit information wirelessly, can allow them some amount of ability to get up, move around a hospital room, is certainly more comfortable for the patient than what they normally would be wearing.
The device embeds sensors into fabric straps, and the patient wears these around their chest, and it monitors their heart, lungs, and arteries all at the same time.
I think the home applications of this technology and other remote monitoring technology, I think we're really just at the tip of the iceberg for where we're going to end up going with this.
The sensors are so tiny that there are billions of them, capturing more than 100 million data points a day for a single patient. The tech took more than a decade to develop.
My father, Dr. Vijay Vardhan, he is the inventor of the technology.
That's Venk Varadhan, the chief exec of NanoAir, the company that designed and developed the garment.
He was doing a lot of defense-related projects on traditional carbon nanotube technology, submarine coating for sonar detection, missile defense systems, and his thesis was if the nanotechnology with such specificity can pick up signals 50 meters underwater or tens of thousands of feet in the air, what's to stop that specificity from picking up signals directly from the human body?
Venk's father Vijay couldn't use the carbon nanotube technology for a wearable device because carbon is corrosive and obviously potentially poisonous.
Over the next sort of 10 to 15 years, he sort of came up with different sort of iterations of this chemical composition to come up with a cloth-based or a textile-based nanotechnology solution that could pick up these really low frequencies from the body.
In terms of cost per unit, Venk said it was in the hundreds of dollars, at least when producing at volume.
We are capturing over 120 million data points per patient per day. A smartwatch, for example, only captures up to 5 million data points per day. And that helps us be a much cleaner signal because we're aggregating all of that information.
So let's take a step back. What kind of data are you giving to the medical professional then?
We give electrical data, hemodynamic data.
That's a measurement of blood flow, say within the arteries or the lungs.
Acoustic data and metabolic data along with activity. We can do vectors across the largest slice of the lungs that are capturing fluid accumulation or changes in lung capacity across the heart, so cardiac output or the blood flow coming out of the aorta and changes to that, as well as stroke volume.
For Venk and John, the doctor in Brooklyn, all of this data can help them to identify patterns and know when a patient's condition is worsening.
Whether we're talking about how the lungs move or what the acoustic information for the way the lungs sound, whether we're talking about the heart rate, we want to combine the information we get from the remote monitoring garment and combine that with the patient's actual clinical information and use that to derive an algorithm to recognize certain patterns in the information. Or in subsequent iterations, potentially have somebody take this garment and wear it at home. My phone's, I've got to take this phone call for 1 second. I'll be right back, just a moment.
So I'm intrigued, Hannah, about how you can integrate the data that's coming off your Fitbit or your other wearables and that of the medical data that is coming out of the emergency room.
At the moment, it doesn't really work. So you're right to raise the point. You know, you hear stories of patients printing out data from their Apple Health to bring into doctors, and doctors, frankly, often not really appreciating it or finding it very useful. The systems that a lot of hospitals run on are old and clunky, and they sort of are struggling to keep up with the basic needs of the hospital, let alone integrate this. But that's going to be a big market for whoever can get it right.
How big is that market expected to be?
Well, so at the moment, digital health is growing and wearables are a part of that market. There's a huge amount of investment in this. It hit a new high of $8.4 billion in the third quarter of 2020. Big tech companies are also really interested in getting into this, and we can see that they have this expertise in sensors and data. You saw Google acquiring Fitbit recently, and that is not just for the sort of wellness market. That is because they're thinking further ahead about how to use their expertise to integrate these kinds of different kinds of data.
As I was flying from Frankfurt to Norway, I noticed my blood oxygen was unusually low. My heart rate was much, much higher than normal.
That's Michael Snyder, the chair of Stanford's medical school. He was an early convert to smart devices, wearing a smartwatch and using a pulse oximeter to read his blood oxygen levels.
Then when I landed, it didn't come back to normal. It stayed actually fairly elevated on my heart rate. My blood oxygen stayed low. Later, I got a low-grade fever. I finally went to a doctor in Norway, and I said, look, I may have Lyme disease. Can you check me out? And he drew blood, and sure enough, my immune cells were up that tell you that you've got something going on, a bacterial infection.
10 days later, Michael flew home to California.
Later, I measured, and sure enough, I was Lyme positive. My blood told me that. And it's perfectly controlled because just before I left, I'd given blood several days, and I was negative. These devices first tipped me off before I was even had symptoms, and we were able to figure that out from a simple smartwatch and a pulse ox.
Michael describes himself as a believer in wearables.
I normally use about 8 devices every day. So I'm wearing 4 smartwatches right now. I normally have a ring that's a sensor. I wear something called a continuous glucose monitor that measures my glucose levels.
He thinks wearables will be particularly important in diseases like COVID, where you can be spreading the virus before you get symptoms. The devices could be an early warning system that you're about to get ill. So when COVID hit in March 2020, he and his team at Stanford started monitoring the heart rate of over 6,000 volunteers using smartwatches.
It's a 2-part study. The first part is to improve our algorithms to be able to better detect when people are getting ill. And so we got a lot of people in who already had COVID and were wearing a smartwatch, either a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or other devices. And we looked at their data and we saw when they got their symptoms, when they were diagnosed, and we perfected our algorithms around resting heart rate initially. We showed that you could detect people getting ill on average 4 days before they got symptoms. We can see the resting heart rate go up on average. And for some people, it'll be as many as 10 days.
The algorithm still needs some work. It can't identify the difference between someone with COVID or another disease. But at least when there was a lot of COVID circulating, it could detect about 70% of confirmed cases.
We're trying to bring in other things like respiratory rate, blood oxygen, something called heart rate variability, skin temperature. We can measure all these things right from a smartwatch. And we're trying to see what their contribution is to specific health signals, if you will. So if you have a COVID infection, maybe 4 of the 5 things I just mentioned will go off so that you can actually see, what kinds of illnesses trigger what kinds of physiological changes.
So I think these experiments are fascinating, and I think that they're really setting the stage for how patients could be monitored in the future. But crucially, there's a really long way to go from research to getting wearables actually adopted and regularly used in your local hospital or doctor's office.
Health systems aren't using them so much right now because, quite frankly, they're very conservative. It's a new technology. They don't adopt new technologies very well, and they don't realize their power. I think they're just starting to now, thanks to the pandemic, unfortunately. But telemedicine was really not used very much until the pandemic came along. And now the pandemic's hit, people say, well, yeah, of course, telemedicine's a great way to do things. People don't come in and spread their germs around. But that was obvious even before the pandemic. There was just no reason to change the system. And I think that's what's going to be powerful about these wearable devices. I think as people realize their power, once you show utility, then they'll spread quickly.
So listening there to Michael Snyder, he's saying that the healthcare systems are very conservative. Do you think this crisis has helped them overcome that innate conservatism?
I think that the money they got during this crisis has helped them overcome that conservatism. And so there are a lot of questions about what would happen if it went away. One of the reasons why telemedicine was suddenly very successful in the US was hospitals started to be reimbursed at the same rates for a virtual visit as they were for an in-person visit. Now, that gets a bit more complicated when it comes to this kind of remote monitoring activity that wouldn't be necessarily a discrete visit. So I think that he's right to raise all these concerns about whether the infrastructure will really adapt quickly enough to make the most of these new technologies. It's important to understand how the US healthcare system works. It's so fragmented that some say it's not a system at all. It gives patients, at least those with insurance, a lot of choice, but then it expects them to shuttle their information between different providers, like a family doctor or a specialist. The key to ensuring wearables work will be making sure the data gets to the right clinician and that someone is willing to pay for it. Doctors will be far more likely to adopt new technologies if health insurance will pay them to do so, and insurers are only going to do this if it's good value for money.
The technology for wearables has been evolving so quickly, but integrating that data into the health system has been a little bit slower.
That's health economist Catherine Baker. She's the dean of the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. Catherine's research over the years has focused on the effectiveness of public and private health insurance, including the effective reforms on the quality of care.
Some of the innovation that we've seen in the US in integrating data and integrating care across settings are from integrated insurers, where the hospital, the doctor, the pharmacist are all part of one system that sees all of the information about a patient and can help bridge those silos.
These healthcare systems are far more like what you'd see in countries where the government dominates healthcare, like the UK. They communicate and can keep all this data inside the same system, and they're also incentivized to save money because they keep the change. But only about a third of Americans are in these schemes.
One doctor that they see may not be in communication with the hospital that they go to, or another doctor that they see, or their mental health provider may not have integrated information with their physical health provider. And that lack of integration of data makes it even harder to integrate information from a novel data source like wearables. So I think it will take a long time to diffuse in the US healthcare system because of the patchwork nature of both providers and insurance.
How much is cost an issue? Does health insurance ever cover these kind of data sources?
Cost is definitely an issue, and the extent to which health systems can integrate the data to treat patients better, I think motivates covering some of that equipment like wearables under health insurance plans. But I think there's increasing evidence that there's an opportunity to use things like wearables to monitor how patients are doing, but also to modify their behaviors in a way that might have health benefits. And if the health benefits accrue over a time frame that the insurer can actually see benefits from, I think we're much more likely to see that equipment covered by insurance premiums.
Catherine was right to point out that insurers have a lot of power here. They have the purse strings. So if they incentivize hospitals to do more of this remote monitoring, then they may end up more rapidly adopting it.
What would this mean for the cost of patient care, Hannah?
It could significantly cut it. The average cost of a hospital stay is about $2,000 a day per patient in the US. But the questions are, who actually benefits from saving that money? Will the hospital get to keep some of it, the insurer, or the patient themselves? Five months into the wearables trial at the hospital in Brooklyn, we spoke to Dr. John Marshall again.
Just letting the honking go.
At that stage, John and his team were continuing to enroll COVID patients in the wearable trial. He said it could take many months before they devise an algorithm from the data, but he did have some other news.
The Simple Sense garment that we're using for this study did just get FDA clearance. And I think that's good news for the wearable market in general. Ultimately, wearable technology is going to radically transform the way we manage people's health chronically. We're thinking about this as a way to begin to manage, maybe an acute disease or a small set of chronic diseases. But it's easy to imagine this being the method. Maybe it's a decade from now, maybe it's 20 years from now, maybe it's only 2 years from now. I feel very strongly that that's actually going to become the standard of care going forward.
The company that developed the garment, Nanoware, is confident that the FDA clearance will mean the device gets covered by Medicare, the US government insurance scheme for seniors. That could make it far more likely to be adopted by health systems.
We all know the first computers were massively expensive and have become much cheaper and much faster. Hopefully, as the wearable technology scales up, that'll also be able to become less expensive for the individual patient, less expensive for the healthcare system of the hospital that's providing that wearable technology.
Eventually, I believe wearables will transform healthcare. For so long, we have been relying on data collected by technologies that are hundreds of years old. The thermometer was invented 300 years ago, the stethoscope over 200 years ago, the device we use to measure blood pressure over 120 years ago. In the future, doctors tracking data continuously should be able to understand what our bodies look like when they're healthy and how they start to get ill. That could open the door to far more treatments if we catch disease earlier and earlier.
Next time on Tectonic, how did Taiwan use technology to stem the spread of COVID-19?
The main lesson I would advise is to bring technology to where people are, instead of asking people to come to the technology.
You've been listening to Tectonic from the Financial Times in London, with me, John Thornhill. Our reporter this week was Hannah Kuchler. This episode was produced by Liam Noland. Sound design and mixing was by Breen Turner and Louise Burton, and we had help from Persis Love. Amy Keane was the editor, and the executive producer, Cheryl Brumley. Original music was composed by Metaphor Music. Our thanks to Dr. Ali Rezi, Harpreet Rai, Dr. Bill Marks. Last month, residents of Taipei, Taiwan's capital, were celebrating the Lunar New Year. Unlike most of the world, life in Taiwan throughout 2020 continued mostly as it did before the pandemic. The story of why this island experienced a very different kind of health crisis begins 1 year ago, during the same annual holiday. On the final day of January 2020, a cruise ship named the Diamond Princess docked at the Taiwanese port city of Keelung. The ship had set off from Hong Kong 6 days previously, with more than 3,500 passengers and crew on board. Eric Chung, a 68-year-old tourist from Hong Kong, and his wife, Wong Wong, were on board, celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary. Eric says he'd just retired. He'd worked as a warehouse manager, and he and Wong Wong had booked the cruise as a special treat for their anniversary. Their tour set off from Hong Kong on January the 25th, the first day of the Lunar New Year. Their plan was to go ashore at Yokohama and spend 4 days in Japan before the trip finished on February the 2nd. The Diamond Princess docked in Keelung at around 6 a.m. on January the 31st. News of a novel virus in the Chinese city of Wuhan had been reported throughout January. Eric and his wife and around 3,000 other passengers and crew disembarked to spend the day on shore. Eric and Wong Wong took a train westwards beyond the capital Taipei to a district called Zhongli to visit an old friend. The journey took about an hour. They had a meal with their friend before travelling back again to Keelung. According to Eric, they had to make it back to the cruise ship before 5 p.m. They walked around the shops at Keelung Station and ate some street food, and says most of the shops were still closed because of the holidays. But in the days to come, their data footprint and that of more than 3,000 other passengers and crew would become vital to Taiwan's authorities. A few days later, with the Diamond Princess docked in the Japanese city of Yokohama, 10 positive cases of coronavirus were identified on board the ship. The virus spread rapidly, rising to 690 cases within 2 weeks.
What the government does say is that any new cases that are going to be declared, these people contracted the virus before the quarantine began. They do not believe that any of the cases, even though...
An 80-year-old passenger who had disembarked in Hong Kong on January the 25th had tested positive for coronavirus, meaning the virus had already been working its way through the ship before it docked in Taiwan. In the end, Eric and his wife tested negative. But in Taiwan, the government began a race against the clock to contain the virus, using big data analytics. And it worked. You're listening to Tectonic. I'm John Thornhill, Innovation Editor at the Financial Times, and your host for the series. This season, we're exploring how the pandemic is accelerating the transition to an online world and transforming so many aspects of our lives. In this episode, we're looking at how Taiwan tracked the location data of more than 600,000 citizens to stop the initial spread of COVID-19. Just how far are those who live in democratic societies willing to trust big government with their data? Catherine Hiller, FT's Greater China correspondent based in Taipei, has been reporting for this episode.
I came back to Taiwan about 2 years ago. I was based here before for the FT, but in between I reported from Beijing and from Moscow. I remember last year quite vividly, mostly because for everyone in Taiwan, this was a sense of deja vu. In 2003, Taiwan underwent a SARS epidemic, and that epidemic too, in that case too, the virus had come from China. When the Diamond Princess docked in Taiwan, I didn't notice it at all because I don't normally visit Keelung Harbor. The moment I started paying attention to it was when it arrived in Japan and when it became known that there was an outbreak aboard the ship and that the ship had been in Taiwan just a week earlier. Taiwan's government would try to identify the exact movements of the ship's passengers and crew during their day's visit in Keelung. The person in charge of that whole operation was Chen Ximai, Deputy Prime Minister. He is now mayor of Kaohsiung, Taiwan's third largest city, but at the time he was in charge of the operation in the cabinet. I traveled to the south of Taiwan, about 400 kilometers south of Taipei, to Kaohsiung, where he works now. The day he was speaking to me was a very busy day for him. When he came in, he directly asked me, let's make it short because we have a public health emergency here. There had been a gas leak in the city. And so while we were speaking, aides were coming running in and handing him their cell phones for him to speak to the people from the fire department and getting briefings from on the scene and barking orders into the phone as to what to do next.
因为那些人没有办法去3000多个人哈，他有一些
Chen said that after a day of investigation, they realized that they couldn't track the movement of all the passengers. So they requested passengers' mobile phone signal data from the telecom operators. That allowed authorities to immediately find out where in northern Taiwan these people had been. Based on the mobile footprints of the passengers, they identified their potential contacts. And then they used the medical insurance data of those potential contacts to do a follow-up investigation. Chen believes that there's a big difference between Taiwan and other countries because Taiwan had been through a SARS outbreak already.
就是台湾跟其他国家有一个很大的不一样，因为台湾碰过 SARS。
He mentioned that after SARS, the government amended the Infectious Diseases Prevention Law.
所以我们的法律的环境是比
The law authorizes the government to access personal data. They can't make this information public, but access to such data for use in an epidemic investigation is permitted by law.
法律上是被允许的。
The task force focused on identifying the GPS of shuttle buses used by the tourists, their credit card transaction logs, CCTV, and mobile location data.
因为那些人没有办法去3000多个人哈，他有一些
They found that when they used the shuttle bus GPS data, the information they got was very limited. It would just track the tour bus, not individual people. When people go to a sightseeing spot, they get off the bus, they run around, they take pictures.
车的 GPS 其实掌握有限，那更何况
Mobile position data proved to be the most useful method as it was able to provide accurate information on the location and time of exposure between people.
3000个人用同样。
Within 24 hours, they had information on 620,000 people.
那后来我们就在1天内，24小时内就把所有的资料都收集，62万人。
So, Catherine, what criteria were used to identify over 620,000 Taiwanese residents who may have come into contact with potential carriers of the virus? And how quickly was such a large group of people identified?
The mobile phone operators identified which phones were the phones used by Diamond Princess passengers. That was actually not very difficult because once these passengers started roaming on the Taiwanese network, so when the ship approached the Taiwan coast, then they were all in one place. They were identified as this group. And after that, only a day after the data sweep was initiated, more than 627,000 people in and around Keelung received a text message. And the text message told them that they should monitor their health. And in case they discovered anything unusual, like flu-like symptoms, temperature, and so on, they should quarantine at home.
And were this group of people tracked in any other way?
Actually, yes. The authorities always stress that the data was anonymized, but they did run the mobile phone numbers of these more than 620,000 people against the mobile phone numbers of members of the National Health Insurance. And they built a kind of software tool that would issue an alert when anyone in this group went to see a doctor for flu-like symptoms. So they would have received alerts and would have then paid special attention to those people. Chen said that there's a lot of caution when it comes to databases. He said that people are reluctant to provide data that can be integrated and analyzed for broader uses.
因为资料库大家都很小心，不愿意提供资料来做一些整合的运用。
He didn't think that the use of this data touched upon privacy rights because it was all depersonalized.
这个有一些没有涉及到一些隐私权的，没有。
Chen also told me that after using big data in the epidemic prevention effort, the government was now also considering how big data can be used in agriculture, transportation, healthcare. He argued that the use of some data allowed the Taiwanese government to react faster.
大概台湾政府会变得更快速。
Is there strong public support in Taiwan for the government when it comes to these kinds of measures, such as conducting a wide sweep of people's location data? In Western countries, it would probably be viewed as an encroachment of privacy.
Yes, actually, in general, there's widespread support for these measures. Given that this is democracy and the epidemic prevention measures are being communicated in a very transparent manner, there's also strong trust that the government will not abuse its access to that data.
Taiwan hasn't always been a democracy, so where did this trust in government come from?
Actually, for the last 5 or 6 years, we've increasingly seen the government use technology to engage people. And I think the main origin of this is the Sunflower Movement. That was a student campaign in 2014 that opposed a trade deal with China. And that movement led to a steep increase in online activism and e-petitions and so on. So this is now, the government has realized that this is a great tool to increase trust, and they've put it to great use.
What you're talking about there is digital democracy, the idea that online platforms can be used transparently to keep citizens informed and engaged in the political decision-making process. And we've seen this approach used in Estonia, Iceland, and local government in Barcelona. Have these European examples played a part in shaping Taiwan's digital democracy?
Yes, so Taiwan is very aware of these experiences in Europe, and Taiwan has looked to these digital European models as examples of how to increase transparency in policymaking. And we actually have somebody called a digital minister here. And so digital minister Audrey Tang, she herself started her political career during the Sunflower Movement, and she has pushed for greater use of digital democracy initiatives.
As the digital minister in charge of social innovation, I have long advocated for the idea of fast, fair, and fun in co-creating with the society. So I got involved in the counter-pandemic effort, I think around early February.
I asked Audrey if she had any apprehension about the government collecting citizens' data at the start of the pandemic.
At that time, I had some apprehension about some of the proposals. There's countless vendors that want to advertise really for their bracelets, for their dongles, for their new devices through GPS or through Bluetooth or through other technologies that will track a finer detail of whereabouts because, or so they claim, that the cell phone tower triangulation is so very imprecise, especially in rural areas where there's not so many cell phone towers. But even if in municipal places, the resolution is just 50 meters in radius. So they said that you couldn't know which room the person is in or which floor the person is in. You only know the generic whereabouts.
Early in the pandemic, Taiwan's government established a system called the digital fence.
Their phone is placed into the digital fence so that if they break out of that place, then of course the automated text message is sent to the local police and so on. And that system basically is deemed constitutional because it doesn't collect new data. It is existing triangulation data that your cell phone tower operators are collecting anyway. And we use the SMS systems for earthquake advance warning and flood advance warning as well. If people understand the technology is not like the GPS and it's not going to read through its SMS communication or other apps running on their phone, then people will feel much more comfortable understanding that after the 14 days, there's no constitutional basis for us to keep using the digital fence system on the people under quarantine. So it avoids a labeling effect.
Taiwan wasn't the only East Asian democracy to use the location data of its citizens. South Korea's system of mass testing and contact tracing proved largely successful in containing the virus, at least until December 2020, when outbreaks of COVID-19 began to rise.
I think it's important to understand the legal framework for how the tracking system works.
That's Edward White, the FT's bureau chief in Seoul.
I think there's a view in some parts of the world that it's very invasive, and in some ways it is. Basically, government agencies, certain agencies in certain circumstances, can access phone records, that sort of geolocation data off your cell phone, off your smartphone. They can access your credit card data, and they can use CCTV footage from wherever they want to locate and track people. This is obviously something that has applied at times during the pandemic.
Speaking to people in the West, my impression is that probably a majority of people in Europe and maybe also in the US think such an approach is totally unacceptable. So that kind of access that governments here have to people's data, the phone location data, and maybe the combination with other data sources as well, is maybe undermining civil liberties. What's your sense in South Korea, how people view the fact that the government can access that data, and how do they view these measures that have been taken during the pandemic?
What you've really seen, I think, is that people understand that this is actually a life and death situation. They're aware of the risk. They don't exist in a world where they think that this isn't a real threat to themselves and to their families and to their communities. So they are willing to be part of the broader community, and they're willing to do their part. And I think this is a question of how the West actually looks at countries in Asia. And I think there's a view sometimes, and perhaps was maybe true in the past, there's a view that some of these populations are still very submissive, that these are the hangovers of recent or comparatively recent military dictatorships. But I think that's a fallacy from my point of view, having lived in Asia for a wee while. These are about sort of common courtesies. It's about understanding the public health risk. And while, yes, they do have to give up civil liberties for a wee while, I think there's an understanding that it won't be permanent. And should it become permanent, I think then you would see a backlash, and then you would see people being more concerned about it. But when you look at what's happening in Europe and you think, well, these are places that don't have these systems in place, and yes, they're going back into lockdowns, having had all of these warnings and having had the lessons that Asia has provided, I think that actually underscores for a lot of people in South Korea that actually their system is the right one.
I think as citizens and as consumers, actually, we both have, I think, rights and responsibilities. We shouldn't just expect our data to disappear into vast lakes or diffuse clouds without asking questions around what is being done with it, in whose interest, for what purposes.
That's Sir Nigel Shadbolt, a professor of computing science at Oxford University. Nigel is also the co-founder of the Open Data Institute in London. The institute works with governments and companies to build trustworthy data systems focusing on ethical issues around how people's data is collected, managed, and used. Given the examples of Taiwan and South Korea, I was keen to discuss how other governments can ensure that people's data are collected and stored securely during a public health emergency.
You can collect the data and you can simply maintain an exposure graph. You don't have to have the identities dereferenced to be very useful as a tool that models how infection might be moving through a community. So again, the extent to which information needs to be disclosed under what conditions can be adjusted given the context. And these are positive use cases. Too often, though, a government finds itself in possession of this very powerful resource and really can't resist the urge to use it in other contexts.
Nigel, there's always a danger of mission creep in this area, isn't there? I remember in your book, The Spy and the Coffee Machine, you gave the example of the murder of Anna Lindh, Sweden's foreign minister, in 2003, when the police accessed the National Biobank to look for data which would help their criminal investigation. So is it a difficult thing to stop data being collected for one purpose being used for another?
It is. And I think the part of the requirement on us as open societies, as deliberative democracies, is to say, constantly reinterrogate those boundaries. The extent to which DNA profiling now is being routinely used in criminal investigations, the extent to which data collected under one regime, for example, genealogical research, is suddenly turning up being used for cold case purposes in all sorts of criminal investigations. Now, we have to be very careful that we understand where we are comfortable that this mission creep hasn't become just simply out of control.
Nigel, when we talk about data, there's often quite a lot of concern about surveillance capitalism, the kind of corporate tracking of our personal data in the West. But there's also surveillance communism in China and the kind of state surveillance of citizens. Are you pessimistic about how this data is going to be used? And how can we tilt the playing field more towards the positive uses of data?
We can find extremely positive uses of data. And I think it's really important we don't become thoroughly dystopian about the technology and the opportunities. Data availability and the ability to innovate and produce really valuable outcomes, there are so many examples of it. Again, if we look at the scientific collaborative effort, the generation and production of the vaccines, the sharing of fundamental scientific knowledge at every level has shown what we can do. And if we believe in the West that fundamental values around autonomy, self-determination, dignity, the right of certain liberties for individuals, understood in the context of a wider collective good, we've got to argue those values, it seems to me. Let's have the argument about the values and the priorities and the trade-offs between those values, between ourselves as informed citizens and consumers and as nation states.
As Nigel suggests, there are no simple answers, but it is vital that all of us in civil society keep fighting to ensure good outcomes of data use. Next time on Tectonic, has the pandemic changed the world of education for good?
There's no way that universities can, at their current pace, come near to satisfying demand in the market. Universities do a great job in educating the whole human. They are not set up for dealing with rapid societal change.
You've been listening to Tectonic from the Financial Times in London with me, John Thornhill. The reporter this week was Katrin Hiller. The producer and editor was Liam Nolan. Location sound in Taiwan was recorded by Aki Chen. Sound design and mixing was by Breen Turner, and we had additional audio editing by Howard Shannon. Nicole Liu in Hong Kong and Edward White in Seoul provided additional reporting. Emma Zhu in Beijing helped with translation. Our executive producer was Cheryl Brumley, and original music was composed by Metaphor Music. The first day of school can bring up the memory of crisp autumnal air, jumpers, and a bright red apple to give to the teacher. But for many students around the world this year, it began with a video call.
Nothing like you would imagine a first day of kindergarten. He had one Zoom call. The teacher introduced himself, and he made sure everyone could get online, and that was it.
Lockdowns and stay-at-home orders prompted school systems across the globe to teach remotely. In a matter of days, classrooms moved online.
You hear a lot of the jokes are like, and then the teacher said to go, log into Zing Zang and use the... There is an element of like, you have to go to a lot of places to check it out.
Like, do I turn this in on Google or do I turn this in on whatever video application they were using? I don't even remember the name of it.
And parents had to adapt to school at home.
But second grade's not hard to teach. Well, it is. It's impossible to teach, but I at least have the the knowledge.
Gym had the most reading. Gym class.
Which hasn't always been easy.
No child in kindergarten can read to themselves. So that meant 50 pages of reading to your child every day.
While there have been difficulties, technology has created moments of innovation.
One time a day, the teacher would do a scavenger hunt, and then they'd have to go run around their house and find something, and then they'd get to show what they found. And it was the highlight of every kid's day.
They start at 9. They have their morning meeting, right, Talia? And they do just different like social fun games.
Yeah, we do like different games.
In Talia's class, they play a digital version of the childhood game, Guess Who's Missing? In the pandemic, it's made possible by tiled layouts and virtual breakout rooms.
When everyone has been put into the waiting room, the teacher lets the chooser back in, and then they have to find out who went missing.
But the shift to online learning hasn't been easy for all, especially for university students.
I had always romanticized the idea of going to university and meeting up with my classmates after for a coffee, stuff like that. And I feel like I am genuinely missing out on what the university experience actually is.
It's like harder to feel passionate about any of the subject matter and to concentrate. So I guess I would say that like that sort of like interpersonal relationship aspect of an educational space is probably the hardest thing to not have.
There's only 4 years to enjoy it, and they let you pause it whenever you want and resume it whenever you want. And like, why would you settle for the shittier experience, I guess?
The pandemic has proved that it is possible to study entirely online. But do people want to? You're listening to Tectonic. I'm John Thornhill, Innovation Editor at the Financial Times and your host for the series. This season, we're exploring how the pandemic is accelerating the transition to an online world and transforming so many aspects of our lives. The crisis has put the education sector into overdrive and accelerated the way we use technology to study. In this week's episode, we're looking at the growth of online education courses. It's an area where enrollment has strongly increased over the past 12 months. EdTech companies are offering flexible courses, which for many adults, including those who have lost jobs during the crisis, offer an opportunity to upskill and change careers. Are we on the verge of a new way of learning? And in turn, creating a jobs market that is more responsive to technological change? About 1.4 billion students of all ages in more than 130 countries have spent parts of the past year adapting to learning online. The uptick in virtual learning has pushed online courses to become more flexible and sophisticated. Patrick McGee, the FT's San Francisco correspondent, has been looking at the growth of online education for this week's episode.
Distance learning has been around for the past few decades. Then the pandemic came along and demand really went into overdrive. The recent shift to increased online learning has been taking place worldwide, and some analysts think the global edtech sector will be worth somewhere in the region of $350 to $400 billion by 2025. There's been a huge surge of interest over the past year in online courses that teach new professional skills, particularly courses designed for adult learners. Some of the main edtech companies specializing in these courses are Udemy, Udacity, Springboard, and Coursera, and they're attracting students from all walks of life.
So, Tony Boswell, where are you calling from today?
Kansas City, Missouri, at my home.
Tony was a truck driver for 14 years.
I mean, I'm not gonna lie, it's a rough life. You sleep in the back of a 10x8 box, you shower in a truck stop, you eat whatever you can grab while you run in the store, and you hit the road and you're eating with your hands on the wheel.
One day in his late 40s, Tony decided he didn't want to live that life anymore.
My wife and I are living two entirely separate lives. She's got a life at home with her job. I have a life on the road. We never see each other. The last year I was in trucking, my wife was doing the taxes. She says, "Do you realize how many days you were gone this year?" And I said, "I don't know, 250 or so, And she said, "No, you're gone over 320 days this year." She said, I've barely seen you a month and a half this year. And I'm like, oh my God, I mean, how can I do this to my wife? I mean, we're empty nesters now. We're supposed to be together. It just came down to that, what am I doing?
How many days? 320 days?
320 days, yeah.
Tony was scrolling through Facebook trying to figure out what to do next, and he saw an ad for a scholarship to take a class in front-end development from an ed tech company called Udacity.
They actually asked you one question, and that was why you felt you deserved a scholarship. And I found myself by the end of writing it, I had tears rolling down my cheeks, I never realized how sad and how bad I hated driving a truck. So I sent it off and I never thought about it again.
We'll come back to Tony in a bit. I want to take a look at Udacity first. It's one of a number of companies in the US offering edtech courses like AI for healthcare, Intro to Self-Driving Cars, Programming for Data Science. A typical course costs close to $400 a month, and most take 4 months to complete. Now that's provided a student spends 5 to 10 hours a week on it. So that's about $1,600 for a course. And when you graduate, you get something called a nano degree. The company CEO, Gabe Del Porto, says the company's model matches what the labor market is really like these days. He believes skills become obsolete quickly, and the degree you graduate with might not be useful in 5 or 10 years. You need to constantly reinvent yourself. Gabe himself has changed careers several times.
Yeah, I always kind of joke I'm a little bit like a purple unicorn. I'm a nuclear engineer by training, and I have been a strategy consultant, a chief marketing officer, chief financial officer, now CEO, none of which a nuclear engineering degree prepared me for.
It's not clear to me from the narrative that you did retraining. Were you doing education on the side?
I would say, unfortunately, most of what I learned was on-the-job training and people taking fortunately, people taking a chance on me.
Gabe argues that universities just cannot meet the demand of workers in particular industries. They aren't designed to move quickly and be nimble.
Stanford has a great AI program, for example, but they're graduating dozens of AI degrees per year, dozens, right? There's literally millions of open AI jobs around the world right now. There's no way that universities can, at their current pace, come near to satisfying demand in the market. Universities do a great job in educating the whole human. They are not set up for dealing with rapid societal change.
Patrick, that rapid societal change Gabe is speaking about has been seen across a variety of sectors during the pandemic. We've seen demand for employees in sectors such as IT and e-commerce surge, whereas the likes of aviation, leisure, and hospitality have suffered. Have these seismic changes caused a lot more people wanting to upskill using these kinds of courses?
So yes, we're seeing lots of it. At this stage, it's difficult to put an exact number on the number of new students who've enrolled across the US in online courses directly because of the pandemic. But the chief execs of edtech companies I spoke to said they'd seen unprecedented levels of enrollment. The CEO of Coursera, Jeff Maggioncalda, told me that between March 2020, so really the start of the pandemic in the US, and September, the company added 21 million learners, an increase of more than 300%. And that's pretty staggering.
What courses have you taken, Patrick?
Well, I mean, look, I'm a bit of an exception. I have 2 children under the age of 3, so I can't say that this has really been like the time to learn a foreign language or become an engineer. So I sort of have to opt out of that.
How have traditional universities fared during this crisis?
I think it's been sort of a crisis, hasn't it? I mean, so many universities, they charge insane levels of tuition in the US because there's just such demand, and they haven't in previous years really adopted or embraced the online model all that much. And now they've been forced to, but they just haven't been prepared for it. So I think you have just an attempt to do university classes as if the pandemic isn't going on, which just means let's do some Zoom classes, but they don't really have the infrastructure set up. We spoke to a number of university lecturers about the experience of having to transition in March 2020, almost overnight, to online teaching.
Oh, it's exhausting. It's still exhausting.
Christopher Ali is an assistant professor at the University of Virginia, where he teaches media. When the pandemic started, his university extended spring break to give professors time to transition all of their classes online.
We were kind of in triage mode, and I had to just keep reminding myself that my job is to get my students through this semester. My concern was, of course, how do I transition? How do I do this? How do I move a course online? I have no training in online pedagogy.
Christopher actually researches the digital divide in the US, why some Americans have access to high-speed internet and some don't. The pandemic brought his research home.
I didn't know which of my students had broadband and which ones didn't have broadband. Didn't have a connection good enough, for instance, to do a Zoom chat, to do a live two-way video, to be able to stream.
So last summer, Christopher took classes on how to teach online to prepare for the fall semester of remote learning, and he learned some things.
You can't do everything, so don't try to do everything. And that I need to be reminded of that a lot. Online education is an entirely different beast.
Christopher wasn't alone in taking on that beast. By the middle of March 2020, only a couple of weeks into the first phase of lockdown, more than 1,100 colleges across the country had canceled in-person classes and moved everything online. While traditional universities have struggled to figure out, as Christopher put it, the beast of online learning during the pandemic, EdTech probably couldn't have designed or orchestrated a better scenario for them to thrive. The thing is, online learning isn't new. It's been growing for the past 20 years, really since the internet took off.
The online education segment of higher ed globally has been continuing to take share and to grow, but it's been very slow and steady, very kind of measured and consistent over the years.
That's Sean Gallagher. He's the executive director of the Center for the Future of Higher Education at Northeastern in Boston, where online education has been a growing focus of his research for several years.
And the COVID-19 pandemic absolutely has been a key inflection point. So for example, fall 2020 higher ed enrollment in the US, if you look at primarily online institutions, which are just one segment of the overall market, their enrollment is up 7%. If you look at Google search trends or enrollment in various online course programs, it's really booming.
So what do you get from these online programs? A degree?
So Udacity offers something called a nano degree, right? Like a mini degree. And, does this have the same credential as an MBA from Harvard? I mean, clearly not. But if you've got a traditional degree and then you can sort of bulk up your work with these nano degrees, it is something to put on the resume or to put on your LinkedIn profile. And I think with more and more awareness of these degrees, you are seeing more and more recognition that, this is not just a sort of meaningless certificate. It's not a book report, right? It's hyper pragmatic. But the common thread for all of these companies is they're designed to be online, flexible, and they're more accessible than traditional higher education. The average cost of 1 year of college for a student living on campus is around $50,000 at a private college and around $25,000 at a public college. Debt loads that Americans often carry well into or past their 30s. The other thing to know about these companies is they tend to focus on specific skills, coding or machine learning, user experience design, rather than a broader education, what we think of as a liberal arts education, or in my experience, a humanities education.
So I'm unlikely to study a philosophy degree from one of these companies, you think?
This is one of the questions I had. Yeah, I was hoping I could read, Plato to Derrida or something over the course of 2 years. Just not what they offer at all. First, let's go back to Tony Boswell, the trucker from Missouri. He just applied for a scholarship in front-end development with Udacity.
I didn't think in a million years I was going to win that contest, But to my surprise, I got an email that said I did, and I was totally blown away.
Tony has been passionate about coding for his whole life. He started coding when he was a teenager on a Commodore 64 in the early 1980s.
I adore my 64, my Commodore 64. Believe it or not, I was a D&D kid. I played Dungeons & Dragons and rolled dice, and I got tired of rolling the dice for all the character sheets, so I built myself a character generator that rolled the dice for me. All I had to do was hit a button.
64K memory at a price that will put a computer in every home, business, and school years before anyone.
But the path to actually working in the field of computer science felt closed off to him.
I went into trucking because I didn't have a lot of other options. I went to a little bit of college. I found out that I never had geometry. And so when I got into calculus for electronics engineering, it was kind of hard learning calculus, geometry, and physics all at the same time. And I failed out of college because of that. Any kind of dream that I had was just shattered.
After years of not fulfilling his dreams of completing further studies, the front-end development course from Udacity gave Tony a sense of purpose. He devoured the course and was selected to go further and study a nano degree from Udacity, also on a scholarship.
I was so proud. I went and told my wife. I had tears streaming down my cheeks. It was a grateful moment. I don't know how else to explain that to you.
Tony is now a front-end developer, and his story really underscores a lot of what online learning companies say makes them special. The classes were flexible, he didn't need to travel or relocate anywhere to take them, and they were skills-focused. They were meant to get him a job in a specific field.
Patrick, that's great to hear about Tony. I'm curious though, have these EdTech courses like the ones Udacity offer attracted more people like Tony who already have years of working experience?
I think it's difficult to say it's this gender, it's this age bracket that's really engaged in online education. There's a certain sense in which nobody's going to, necessarily look down at you if you lost your job during the pandemic. It's such a global event. It's just clear that it wasn't just people that weren't doing their jobs properly that lost their jobs. However, if, you've been out of work for 6 months, just the psychological toll of that can be really difficult. And if you can actually say, look, I'm a go-getter. So I understood that I couldn't be in hospitality for 6 months because all the restaurants and hotels were virtually closed. But I spent that 6 months doing this, and this course, right? I think that's just a real way to signal to employers. When the going got tough, I retrained and learned 3 new skills. But there's one thing that a lot of online graduates worry about, and that's whether employers value their EdTech qualifications. Online learning programs just don't seem to carry the same currency as traditional educational institutions. But there are signs that online learning credentials are gaining currency. Here's Sean Gallagher again from Northeastern. He researches the intersection between higher education and the world of employment.
So if you ask most hiring managers, even 10 years ago, how would they view the quality of a credential earned online? It was only about 30 or 40% who said they would view it as equivalent to something that was done in person or on a traditional campus. Today, we believe that's well over 60%.
Sean says a lot of credibility comes from reputation and familiarity. Employers tend to think about questions like, have we hired someone from this online learning program before? Did they actually have the skills or credentials that they said they would have? And part of the challenge for employers is there's no guidebook, there's no standard for evaluating the diverse world of online programs.
It would be impossible, even if you had a database, to be able to interpret and understand what all of these offerings and educational credentials mean. That's part of the value of educational credentials, is when they reach a certain scale, they're understood and they really signal something.
So employers tend to build their whole concept of who is qualified based on something they're familiar with, a university degree.
That may shift in the future. You have had companies like IBM and a number of others very publicly make a shift in their strategy and say that they are entertaining people with alternative qualifications and really trying not to rely on degrees in the hiring process and getting much more granular and open about it. But that process, principally, it's about education and experience. And education is partly just a proxy for, can you do the job? How qualified are you in that domain that you studied in?
Christopher Ali, the University of Virginia professor, the one who found the shift to online classes exhausting, thinks the pandemic is pushing universities to innovate and be more flexible.
We have to learn to be more dynamic as a field. We have to learn to embrace new technologies. I mean, maybe what we'll see is that more universities are going to do this hybrid model that so many are doing right now. Maybe we're going to stick with this. I'd love to see universities do a better job allowing students to take 5, 6, 7 years for an undergrad. You know, there's no reason why one needs a 4-year undergrad. So I'd love to see us be more flexible. Maybe this is forcing us to do that.
Christopher doesn't think universities will become obsolete in the future. Instead, he thinks the pandemic may push universities to integrate some of the strengths of online learning, like flexibility. And this is something Sean Gallagher emphasized too.
There's different narratives that are out there. Silicon Valley and people who are sort of skeptics of higher education sort of want to promote a lot of the alternatives and tear down the existing colleges and universities. And on the other side, you have the kind of ivory tower purists who think that online education is just a fad. And, you know, I think the reality is very much in the middle, which makes it messy.
The truth possibly sits somewhere in all of this messiness. The pandemic is boosting online learning companies, and that in turn has forced universities to innovate. And Sean thinks that will change the options that students have.
The main thing, I think, is that students and professionals will have more consumer choice, whereas education historically has been very lockstep and not particularly innovative. Where we are right now is in the in-between with this mixing and matching of online and face-to-face learning, which I think will ultimately arrive at a model that is much more efficient in terms of both delivering it and consuming it.
Patrick, a lot of people are talking about the future of education being a hybrid model, part in-person and part remote. Do you think online learning qualifications will ever challenge traditional universities?
They should, but I don't think they will. I think the value of the Ivy League degree, the value of the 4-year BA is just so entrenched in our culture that I find it quite difficult to imagine that it's going away anytime soon in favor of something that's purely done online. One thing that I think will happen is traditional universities have understood the value of the distance learning prospects, right?
I think one lasting trend that will get accelerated by this pandemic is the move towards renewed emphasis on lifelong learning. And so I think we've seen this huge turmoil in the jobs market as a result of the pandemic, as you've been reporting in this episode. And I think that will be a fundamental change, that people will think very differently about working in one career for 10, 15 years and then thinking, maybe I ought to try something else, and switching to something else. And now you have the capability to do that through these online courses. Next time on Tectonic, the pandemic has led to a surge in e-commerce and growing profits for big tech companies. What does that mean for consumers?
If an entrepreneur wants to start a business that is in any way challenging one of those domains, they basically just can't get funded. They're called kill zones.
You've been listening to Tectonic with me, John Thornhill. Our reporter this week was Patrick McGee. This episode was produced by Camille Peterson, with additional producing and audio editing by Oluwakemi Aladasui. Sound design and mixing was by Breen Turner. Original music was composed by Metaphor Music. The editors and executive producers were Cheryl Brumley and Liam Nolan.
The smoked trout is a big seller.
Max Burgess owns The Secret Smokehouse, a shop in East London that specialises in smoked fish.
Then we've got the hot smoked salmon. We've got hot smoked mackerel.
At first glance, it's not the most obvious place for an e-commerce story.
And then we've obviously got a smoked salmon patty, mackerel patty.
Before the pandemic, most of Max's revenue came from selling his products wholesale to restaurants and hotels.
Yeah, the bread and butter was wholesale.
That all changed a year ago. Max's wholesale business fell by 95% during the first month of restrictions.
That threw a little curveball into the whole system, which was just mental. Boris was on the telly saying,
use food delivery services where you can.
That was the trigger where everybody was jumping online and buying from the website.
In the UK, millions of us did just as Prime Minister Boris Johnson advised on the eve of the first lockdown. we shop more online and have been doing so ever since. The need to switch to online shopping has, arguably, provided consumers with more choice, but it's also caused scrutiny of the e-commerce market. Max is one of the many small business owners who has harnessed the power of e-commerce to survive the pandemic, and he decided not to sell through that big company, Amazon.
The strategy was very much about building our brand as a secret smokehouse and come to our website and support us.
The switch to online shopping by hundreds of millions more consumers during the pandemic has meant that a handful of giant tech companies now possess data on more people's likes and dislikes than at any point in history. As consumers, does this provide us with more choice and convenience? Or are we simply resigned to living in a world where a few big companies dominate the digital marketplace? You're listening to Tectonic. I'm John Thornhill, Innovation Editor at the Financial Times, and your host for this series. This season, we're exploring how the pandemic is accelerating the transition to an online world and transforming so many aspects of our lives. In this episode, we're looking at the rapid growth of e-commerce over the past year. The profits of big tech companies have soared as billions of people have switched to working and shopping more online. This increased power of the big tech companies has made regulators, both in the US and Europe, question how the digital marketplace should operate in the future. The idea of a few big companies controlling the market is an uneasy one for many. Has the pandemic finally created the impetus to rein in the power of big tech? In Max's case, he chose to sell his goods on Shopify, Amazon's nearest competitor, because Shopify allowed him to sell through the Smokehouse's own website. The e-commerce company provides the infrastructure, or the plumbing, so to speak, behind the site, something that appealed to Max.
The logistics of it is incredibly easy. The order comes in, you print that off, and you can print your shipping label. That then ties in with your courier, and then you just pick the order and pack it, and it gets picked up and off it goes. And then they've also got a point of sale system as well, so it all ties in very nicely with your inventory.
Though Shopify is valued at about $150 billion, it pales in comparison with Amazon's $1.5 trillion market value. And for many regulators in this new world of commerce, having one large company dominating the market poses a problem. The pandemic may have just exacerbated it. The FT's Tim Bradshaw has been writing about the growth of e-commerce during the crisis.
As global tech correspondent, I cover a fair number of different things, but over the last year, e-commerce has been a particular focus just because it's been such a huge wave of growth during the pandemic. The biggest change in e-commerce, I think, is that everyone has been forced to use it, whether or not they were ordering things off Amazon every day, or it was the first time they'd ever placed a supermarket order online. That's led to huge growth for companies like Amazon and Shopify, who talked about seeing years of acceleration in what they were expecting to see in the next 5 years, all kind of happening at once. This tech boom has also resulted in some intense criticism of the four major tech companies, both in the United States and the European Union.
The subcommittee will come to order.
In July 2020, the US House of Representatives held a hearing with the chief executives of the four largest tech companies, Apple, Google, Facebook, and Amazon.
In 2013, it was reported that you instructed Amazon employees to approach discussions with certain business partners, and I quote, the way a cheetah would pursue a sickly gazelle. Is the Gazelle project still in place, and does Amazon pursue similar predatory campaigns in other parts of its business?
I cannot comment on that because I don't remember it.
The hearings focused on whether these tech companies are violating antitrust law, basically whether they are suppressing competition and wielding monopoly power in an illegal manner. All these companies, not just Amazon, came under fire for their business practices.
Has Facebook ever threatened to clone the products of another company while also attempting to acquire that company?
Congresswoman, not that I recall.
Is Google steering advertising revenue to Google Search?
Congresswoman, users come to Google Search. It is that traffic, and that's where our source of revenue comes from. So we work hard to earn their trust.
There's a lot of apps on the store, and a lot of people are making a very good living from it.
And you've said that, forgive me for interrupting, but you've said that several times, but that to me might just underscore the monopoly nature of your business, that everybody's got to go through you. There's really no alternative.
Antitrust regulators historically have very much focused on the issue of consumer harm. That's quite hard to make in a lot of these cases because the tech companies are providing many of their services for free. So there really has to be a different kind of standard applied to these companies. What do you think the regulators are going to focus on?
Data, I think, is one of the biggest focus points because that's a way of defining market power and understanding the value of that data in a way that's different to mere sort of price or consumer benefits. And I think there's also a question of how broadly or narrowly we define these different markets. Apple can argue that it's a small player in the mobile phone market, but if you're an app developer that's wanting to sell to iPhone customers, you can only sell that through Apple's App Store. So what is the relevant market there? I think there's becoming a real kind of shift in understanding that when some of these marketplaces are worth tens of billions of dollars by themselves, even if they're a subset of a larger market, there's a willingness from this sort of newer approach of antitrust regulation to really just kind of say, look, this is one company with an extraordinary amount of power over this particular domain.
It's often quite hard to find specific examples of that, but one that the congressional hearings did focus on was the case of Quidsy.
This is a case from 10 years ago where the company behind diapers.com, which sells nappies online, was basically Amazon tried to buy them. Quidsy held out. So Amazon started lowering prices of diapers, nappies on its own website until it became impossible for Quidsy to compete. And in the end, they had to sell out to Amazon. And here's Congresswoman Mary Scanlon questioning Amazon's founder, Jeff Bezos, about the company's 2010 acquisition of Quidsy.
It appears that in 1 month alone, Amazon was willing to bleed over $200 million in diaper profit losses. Mr. Bezos, how much money was Amazon ultimately willing to lose on this campaign to undermine diapers.com?
Thank you for the question. I don't know the direct answer to your question. This is going back in time, I think maybe 10 or 11 years or so. You could give me maybe the dates on those documents. But what I can tell you is that the idea of using diapers and products like that to attract new customers who have new families is a very traditional idea.
Another big part of the critique for all of these tech companies is that they act as gatekeepers. They offer their own products and they decide how other companies' products are displayed and treated. And they have data on how all of those items are performing.
It's as if you're opening up your trade secrets and your cash register to your closest competitor.
That's Sally Hubbard, an antitrust expert and the director of enforcement strategy at the Open Markets Institute in Washington, D.C. She's also the author of a book called Monopolies Suck. Sally says Amazon's status as a gatekeeper and the owner of all that data puts businesses selling their products on Amazon in a very tough spot.
Because when they team up with the online commerce platform like Amazon, they will have no bargaining power. They will have their profits siphoned off with huge commissions. It's really ultimately a losing proposition for any company. At the same time, most companies do not have much of a choice of whether they are going to sell on Amazon or not.
In Europe, the EU filed an antitrust lawsuit against Amazon for how they collect and use data. Here's what Margriet Vestager, the bloc's competition commissioner, says about Amazon's use of data.
As a small merchant, you take a risk. You have to figure out what products should I put out there? What should be the prices? You have to invest. You have to consider. You put your business at risk very, very often when you do that. Amazon, on the contrary, they have all the data. And it's not just about what is sold. It is also how it's paid for, what is returned, what are people looking at next. And that, of course, enables them to do their business with a completely uncomparable low level of risk compared to their competitors on the same platform.
In the US, Jeff Bezos argued that Amazon is big because customers love it.
80% of Americans have a favorable impression of Amazon overall. Who do Americans trust more than Amazon to do the right thing? Only their doctors and the military.
Amazon might be even more popular on Wall Street, though. Shortly before the pandemic hit the US, Amazon became one of only a handful of companies ever to reach a $1 trillion valuation. But since then, its rocketing share price has added another $500 billion in market capitalization. That's more than the entire stock market value of Walmart, which is around $400 billion. Nonetheless, Bezos still argues that Amazon makes up just a small part of a huge global market.
The retail market we participate in is extraordinarily large and competitive. Amazon accounts for less than 1% of the $25 trillion global retail market and less than 4% of US retail. There's room in retail for multiple winners.
Bezos says Amazon competes with lots of other companies, including big ones like Walmart and Target, but that depends on how you define the retail market. Here's Sally Hubbard again.
Amazon likes to say it's not a monopoly because it has 4% of all retail, but that does not hold up under antitrust analysis at all. There is no product market as broad as all retail. When you define that market, what you do is you look at the realm of substitutes. What are the companies that a consumer or a third-party seller could switch to if Amazon changed the prices or the fees or reduced quality? It's just not the case that all retail falls in that category. I mean, if Amazon raises the prices on razors, then the local hardware store is not a substitute. So instead of focusing on these market definitions that the tech platforms like to present, the more helpful thing to look at is the direct evidence of monopoly power, which is the power to control prices or exclude competitors.
Sally says that definition of monopoly power and other foundations of antitrust regulation in the US come from two laws, which were enacted well over a century ago.
We have the Sherman Act, which was passed back in 1898.
Which is all about preventing companies from agreeing not to compete and blocking monopolization of a market. That's when
one company uses its muscle to exclude competition rather than competing on merit.
The second is the Clayton Act, which was passed in 1914, and that prohibits mergers that might lessen competition or create a new monopoly.
Now, what's happened in the United States is that these laws, being quite broad, have been interpreted by courts over the years, and in recent decades, they've really narrowed the laws so that they're not quite working as they're intended.
The government should work to create the conditions in which fair trade will flourish. We should be trying to foster the growth of two-way trade, to open foreign markets, not close our own.
That shift in how the courts interpreted antitrust law was ushered in during the presidency of Ronald Reagan, and an ideology that would define his time in office: neoliberalism.
Remember that being tough on trade and commerce, the lifeblood of the economy, will have the worst possible consequences for the consumer and the American worker.
And the idea was that as you let companies get bigger through mergers and through anti-competitive conduct that excludes competitors, that actually they become more efficient and that consumers will benefit because these companies can charge less as they become more efficient. It's been a 30, 40-year experiment that has failed terribly, and we've seen that when these corporations get bigger and bigger, they do not pass on any savings to consumers. They have less competitors, and therefore consumers end up paying actually higher prices.
There was a burst of antitrust enforcement in the late 1990s.
I understand that you're one of the co-founders of Microsoft. Is that correct? Yes.
When the US Department of Justice brought a case against Microsoft.
What's your present title? Chairman and CEO.
Bill Gates, co-founder of Microsoft, answered questions from government lawyers during a 3-day deposition in 1998. Sally was an intern at the time, learning about antitrust law.
It was actually the last major antitrust case in the United States against a tech monopoly. It's been more than 20 years. And in the meantime, what's happened is the same problems that the US v. Microsoft tried to solve have arisen again. And in fact, today's tech platforms are all really following in the footsteps of Microsoft.
Sally says that at the time, Microsoft had a monopoly and 95% market share on operating systems for personal computers.
To Windows being the most popular client operating system by a wide margin, Mr. Newbold was referring to the market share enjoyed by Windows.
It told companies that made PCs that if they wanted the operating system, they'd need to pre-install Microsoft's Internet Explorer, not the web browsers it was competing with, like Netscape Navigator.
Isn't it a fact that your executives at Microsoft back in April of 1995 were concerned Netscape's web browser posed a threat to Microsoft's Windows platform?
Well,
can you answer yes or no, sir?
I don't know when people began to think of Netscape as a competitor to Windows.
Sally says if the Department of Justice had not intervened, there probably would be no Google Chrome, which is now the world's most popular web browser.
And ironically, Google then did exactly the same thing with its Android operating system, telling the phone makers, if you want our Android operating system, which, by the way, is the only real licensable, viable operating system for phones, then you need to pre-install all of our apps and not allow competitors to have a shot.
Google is attracting regulatory attention too. The Department of Justice announced an antitrust case against Google over its dominance in search last October. But after that burst of activity with the Microsoft case, the US eased off on antitrust enforcement again, which Sally says has allowed for the tech companies to keep solidifying their monopolies. Is the antitrust statute broad enough to regulate the tech industry?
Yes, it is. And actually, I think that even under our current standards that have been made quite weak by the courts, the major tech platforms are all violating the antitrust laws under our current standards. And what we've had is actually a problem where enforcers haven't had the political will to bring these cases.
Sally says the dominance of the big four, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Apple, makes it nearly impossible to compete on the same playing field.
What we have are 4 companies with their own particular domains. And if an entrepreneur wants to start a business that is in any way challenging one of those domains, they basically just can't get funded. They're called kill zones.
From what Sally Hubbard is saying there, it sounds like it might not be a matter of bad laws themselves, but rather of weak enforcement. Is that right, do you think?
Yes, I think that's definitely true. I mean, for a long time, there was a relationship where politicians, particularly in America, were very excited about Silicon Valley and keen on this great American growth story. But that seems to have really changed in the last couple of years, and particularly in the last year with the pandemic, which has demonstrated just how reliant we've all become on a very small number of very, very large tech companies.
I heard one economist talk about Amazon, in effect on it, the marketplace is an incumbent insider trader because it is at the center of all these incredible data flows. It knows far more information about pricing structure, who the customers are, what the sensitivities are in pricing and so on, than anyone who actually tries to sell goods on that marketplace. Do you think that's a good comparison?
Yes, I think it's a great comparison. And I think that the power that gives to, not just Amazon, but also Apple, Facebook, Google, is because there's so much data that they can see about what's going on in the marketplace. That's data that they've been able to use to inform their product development and acquisition activity.
And why didn't Max at the Smokehouse in East London use Amazon?
He says he thought about it, but he was worried that his products and his brand would just get lost.
If you sell through Amazon, I just think that that's otherwise derogatory to your brand and what you're trying to achieve in your strategy.
Unlike Amazon, Shopify stays in the background. If you look at Secret Smokehouse's website, it isn't obvious that they're even using the platform. Max gets to keep his brand in front of his customers and finds dealing with Shopify pretty straightforward.
Communicate with them, you can email them, you can see all the statistics, analytics about the returning customers. Fundamentally, it all comes down to the economics, okay? So it's about your percentage margin and what you're making, and you want to build a brand.
In the EU, Margrethe Vestager has been spearheading something called the Digital Services Act to create a more competitive digital marketplace.
So the first leg will say, these are the things that you should do. These are the things that you cannot do. For instance, you cannot promote yourself if you're in competition with others on your platform. What you should do could be that those who use your platform should have access to their own data. And the second leg of the Digital Markets Act would allow us to look at the market conditions in market that has not tipped yet, where you do not yet have a gatekeeper for that market, in order to make sure that that market is still open and contestable.
Vestager is cautious, however, about the idea of breaking up big tech.
It obviously would take us to court for a very, very long time. And it's not a given what would be the outcome of breaking up companies, let alone so far I've not had a case where that would be the only remedy.
Sally Hubbard says that breaking up Amazon is only part of the solution. It may still not be enough because of all the ways that Amazon can control its platform.
This would take in-depth investigation to figure out what are all the levers that Amazon is pushing and pulling to distort competition. I think we also need a non-discrimination regime that's going to be requiring that all companies that have to deal with Amazon are treated the same, and Amazon cannot self-preference or prioritize itself in any way.
Tim, we're seeing quite a shift in mood in America at the moment with the Biden presidency. It looks as though both Tim Wu and Lina Khan are joining the administration, and they are two of the most eloquent antitrust experts out there. Do you think we're going to see a renewed impetus from the administration itself to tackle the big tech companies?
I think, to me, that's one of the strongest signs that Silicon Valley needs to worry. I mean, there was perhaps a sense that when Trump left office, that they might have an easier ride under Biden. But, I mean, Lina Khan and Tim Wu are very much at the forefront of drawing up the new rules of engagement around antitrust. And if they are now put in a position of real legislative power, I mean, that's when things really start to change. Silicon Valley isn't going to go down without a fight. They all believe that what they're doing in many ways is benefiting consumers. And if the last year on the stock market is anything to show by, they've got a lot of support from Wall Street investors, which just gives them even more financial firepower to keep doing it. So it's not going to be an easy ride, even with a tougher team going after them in Washington.
The growth of e-commerce is just one of the lasting legacies of this pandemic. Thinking back over the 5 episodes we've produced for this season, I'm inclined to take a long-term view of all this change in our online behavior. One economist who takes a historical perspective is Carlota Perez, who has identified 5 great technological revolutions over the past 250 years. The first was the Industrial Revolution itself. The second, steam engines and railways. The third, electricity. The fourth, oil, cars and mass manufacturing. And finally, the 5th revolution, the information technology revolution, which we're in the middle of right now. Perez points out that after all of these preceding technological upheavals, there has been a great institutional reawakening. Societies have figured out how to adapt to the latest technology, creating new rules for how economies and societies operate. And that's really where regulation comes in. In the past, governments have introduced laws to protect workers in factories or children in mills. And I think that's where we're heading at the moment, a new era of institution building. We've seen the disruption caused by technology, And now we're seeing politicians, lawmakers, and civil society figuring out ways to humanize technology and reassure people that it's being used for societal benefit, not just for private gain. You've been listening to Tectonic from the Financial Times in London, with me, John Thornhill. The reporter this week was Tim Bradshaw. The producer was Camille Peterson. Sound design and mixing was by Breen Turner. The editors and executive producers were Cheryl Brumley and Liam Nolan. Original music was composed by Metaphor Music. Thanks for listening to this reimagined season of Tectonic. We'll be back for another season in the summer, examining the promises and dangers of AI.
I worked hard to get my degree, but I was working even harder to pay off my student loans. Then I found Credible.com. Credible made it fast and easy to compare pre-qualified refinancing rates from top lenders, so it would be faster and easier to pay off my private student loans. I'm saving hundreds of dollars monthly, and checking rates on Credible was free. If you want to lower your private student loan payments, get help from Credible.com.
Message from Credible Operations Inc. Read by an actor. Pre-qualified rates are not an offer of credit. Terms apply. Visit Credible.com for details.
Humans have long hoped and feared we'd build a robot smarter than we are. Are we there yet? I'm John Thornhill, host of Tectonic from the Financial Times. This season, artificial intelligence. From big dreamers...
It is epoch-defining technology in the way that, say, the internet or fire or electricity, these kind of things were.
...to autonomous weapons and encoded bias.
One of the most critical issues to solve in developing ethical AI right now is solving structural racism and sexism in tech.
Does AI's promise outweigh its peril? You can find Tectonic on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Ladies and gentlemen, tonight the Columbia Workshop offers as its 36th production in a series devoted to experimental radio, Karl Čapek's famous play of the machine men, R.U.R.
Back in the late 1930s, American radio listeners learnt a new word.
Time.
Robot.
The future. Rossum's Universal Robots.
The play, Rossum's Universal Robots, written by Czech playwright Karel Čapek, imagined a future where machines do humans' work.
What did young Rossum do?
He invented a worker with a minimum amount of requirements. He rejected men and made a robot. Mechanically, they are more perfect than we are. They have enormously developed intelligence, but they have no soul.
Čapek used an old Slavic word, robota, meaning something like forced labor, to describe these machines, translated into English as robot.
How do you know they have no soul?
Have you ever seen what a robot looks like inside?
No, I haven't.
Very neat, very simple, everything in flawless order. An engineer's product. More perfect than a product of nature.
The robots rebel and eliminate their creators, destroying the human race.
No!
But not before two robots become sentient and fall in love. It's a story whose variations became the stuff of science fiction throughout the 20th century. In this century, sentient robots haven't taken over quite yet, but artificial intelligence is becoming smarter, faster, and changing the way we live.
We're on the cusp of our next great era as a species.
One of the most frontier and potentially revolutionary technology in computer science.
Machine intelligence is here.
The fears Čapek conjured up in his play haven't gone away. Plenty of people see the potential of AI, but still ask, are we building this tech faster than we can control it? This is Tectonic. I'm John Thornhill, Innovation Editor at the Financial Times. We're back with a new 5-part season. This time, we're asking whether the promise of artificial intelligence outweighs its risks. Powerful AI systems are already shaping our economies, societies, and lives. Machine learning is running our internet search engines, opening up pathways for medical research, delivering hyper-fast trading programs on financial markets, and transforming the way that wars are fought. But delegating so much decision-making to machines raises dilemmas. Should we be feeding them all our data? Are we unwittingly embedding human biases in them? And does AI technology really live up to the hype? I'll be trying to answer all these questions along with a team of FT reporters and experts. Is AI going to work for us? Or might it run amok, a little like the Czech robots of a century ago? AI grabbed the headlines in the 90s when a brilliant man needed a challenge.
He dazzled his parents with chess moves at the age of 6 and became the youngest world chess champion in history at age 22. He is now
Garry Kasparov, the world chess champion, needed something new. In 1996, he took on an IBM-built supercomputer named Deep Blue. And Kasparov won.
You have to win the game, you have to dominate the game, and you have to dominate your opponent.
But a year later, the Grandmaster and the machine met again. In the sixth and final game, Kasparov placed his head into his hands.
Deep Blue, Kasparov, after the move C4, has resigned. The match is just suddenly over just like that. Deep Blue has won the match.
After only 19 moves, the contest was over. Kasparov was shaken and furious, accusing IBM of building a machine that was specifically programmed to counter his playing style.
And I personally assure you, everybody here, that if Deep Blue will start playing competitive chess, I personally guarantee you, I'll torn it in pieces.
Within the narrow bounds of the rules of chess, a computer had outthought a human. I was working in Moscow at the time of Kasparov's defeat, and still remember the shock that humanity's champion could be beaten by a machine. If a computer could triumph at a game regarded as the pinnacle of human intelligence, what else could it achieve? I was particularly intrigued by how a computer that was brilliant at one thing, playing chess, was also terrible at another, moving the pieces. AI could work well in narrow domains, but could it ever acquire a more generalized intelligence? By modern standards, Deep Blue counts as a very primitive technology, an expert rules-based system that operated like a $10 million alarm clock, in Kasparov's dismissive phrase. Since then, AI has made startling progress and can now beat humans at almost every game we play.
Good afternoon. I am today's referee. The match will be in Chinese rules.
In 2016, a system called AlphaGo defeated a master of the fiendishly difficult game of Go.
I can't believe what I see right now. Really?
To win the match, a London-based startup, DeepMind, pioneered the use of a technique known as deep learning. It used neural networks which mimic some aspects of how the human brain works. Trained on vast amounts of data, such networks can recognize and replicate highly complex patterns. AlphaGo's success stunned the AI world. In particular, it made a deep impression in China, where they've been playing Go for more than 2,000 years. It's woven into the history there. Go is mentioned in the writings of Confucius, and some legends have it an ancient emperor invented the game to discipline his wayward son. Later, Chinese generals used Go to hone their military strategy. So the triumph of Western technology in the ancient game became something of a Sputnik moment, triggering massive Chinese investment in AI technology, in the same way that the US scrambled to catch up with the Soviet Union after it launched the Sputnik satellite in 1957.
AlphaGo actually came up with a creative new idea in the game of Go that obviously humans have been playing for thousands of years now.
Demis Hassabis is a tech evangelist, a teenage chess prodigy who had a glittering academic career before co-founding that startup, DeepMind.
We hadn't thought of some of these ideas, and that's in a relatively constrained domain, of a board game, albeit the most complex one humanity's ever invented. And that is very suggestive that these types of algorithms and systems may be able to find insights or find intuitions, if you like, that even human experts haven't necessarily found or noticed.
According to Hassabis, this is only the early stages of AI's true potential.
It is epoch-defining technology in the way that, say, the internet or fire or electricity, these kind of things were. I expect there to be, dozens of exciting, hugely impactful breakthroughs in all sorts of domains.
Neural networks are powering many of the latest AI systems, identifying patterns in data to recognize images, voices, and faces. AI-powered technology is also learning to predict the weather and financial market movements, drive cars, and read X-rays. In a visionary paper written in 1965, one of the pioneers of AI, Jack Good, talked about the possibility of creating ultra-intelligent machines. This is him reflecting on that groundbreaking paper.
The question, for example, would arise of the social repercussions of having such a machine. Unemployment, perhaps, because the machine would construct robots and so on for doing manual work, in addition to all the scientists becoming unemployed. The question then that I would address to the ultra-intelligent machine was how to cure these difficulties.
In Good's phrase, such ultra-intelligent machines would be the last invention that humans would ever need to make, because they would then invent everything else for us, and even help respond to the social issues they themselves caused. Demis Hassabis is part of the tradition of blue sky AI thinkers, but he's also pulled inspiration from games. That's how Hassabis started on a small scale, tiny in fact, coding intelligence into little virtual people riding pixelated roller coasters. As a precocious teenager in the 90s, he built video games.
So probably the most famous game I worked on was called Theme Park, which involved a simulation of an amusement park, and thousands of little people would come in to your amusement park and play on your rides and buy things from the shops and so on. And one of my first jobs in the industry was to build the intelligence for these little people. And so they would react in interesting ways to the way you played it. And once I saw how gamers reacted to this AI and this simulation and how much fun they were having out of it, that kind of got me going down this direction. You know, how amazing could it be with AI if that was just a small little sample of what AI could do?
And in time, he came to see that potential as more or less limitless. His crazily ambitious goal, as he put it, was to solve the mystery of intelligence, and then use that knowledge to solve everything else.
Often, if you're interested in the big questions like, what is life? What's the meaning of life? All these kind of things. How did the universe start? What is consciousness? You normally study physics, but I realized that it felt like in the last, say, second half of last century, not that much advances had happened as compared to, say, the early part of last century with Einstein and Niels Bohr and all these people discovering the fundamentals of physics. And it felt to me like we needed some extra intellectual horsepower as humanity to be able to maybe understand the answers to some of the questions we were posing. And that led me to AI as potentially the ultimate tool to help us as scientists understand the world around us.
He co-founded DeepMind a decade ago as something between a research lab and a company. At that time, AI wasn't undergoing the same hype it is today. At first, Demis and his co-founders struggled to get investment for the company. But they stuck to their soaring goal, the goal of building a machine that can think like a human thinks, but even more powerfully. That goal remains far off, and may even be impossible. But DeepMind's progress has been impressive. Google took notice and bought the company in 2014. DeepMind's latest discovery has started to show the incredible real-life uses of neural networks.
This gives you such excitement about the way science works, about how you can never see exactly or even approximately what's going to happen next.
AlphaFold is a project that aims to predict the structure of proteins. A lot of work over the last century has gone into finding structure of protein, and it's a very painstaking sort of process.
That's Pushmeet Kohli, head of AI for science at DeepMind. Last year, AI-powered software written by Kohli's team solved one of nature's greatest riddles: how to predict the 3D structure of proteins to understand how they work.
It's a root node problem, and this is one of the things that when we talk about scientific problems, it's a problem that unlocks so many different areas, and which is why Demis and our team have chosen it.
Each individual protein structure can take years to predict. AlphaFold replaced that difficult lab work with just a few minutes of computer modeling.
Sometimes it might take a PhD student, a whole PhD, to actually even think about one structure.
AlphaFold could fundamentally change biological research and could speed us towards treatments for things like Alzheimer's.
What we are seeing is already sort of scientists leveraging the predictions of AlphaFold in finding out structures of very important proteins that are relevant for many sort of diseases which have unknown sort of structure.
AI in healthcare is something people get really excited about. There are big hopes for automated diagnoses that can allow more people to get help faster, groundbreaking genetic research, or new ways to fight disease. These are all topics that AI researchers are working on. But this takes us into one of the areas where even as the innovation spits out exciting results, it stumbles too. An investigation in 2017 ruled a British hospital gave DeepMind data on kidney patients which should have been protected by privacy laws. Demis Hassabis says more needs to be done to communicate the benefits of medical AI.
The privacy is a massively important question in any domain, but of course, especially when it comes to healthcare. And I think what government needs to do is, make clear the rules of the road. I think in a lot of cases, the public just doesn't understand what the trade-offs are or what the consent is for and so on.
Beyond just medical data, AI is facing public pushback on multiple fronts. As machine brains inch towards being more like ours, researchers worry that training deep learning systems on massive amounts of data generated by humans, like YouTube or internet text, is coding our prejudices into them too. One way AI shows these biases is when it talks to us, which it's getting much better at doing.
Good morning, John.
Last year, I got the chance to interact with a new language generation model that amazed the artificial intelligence world.
My name is GPT-3.
GPT-3 was designed by the research company OpenAI. For fun, I asked a developer to prompt GPT-3 to write me a biography. what I wished my bio was. We asked GPT-3 to reimagine me as a Star Wars hero.
John Thornhill was already a decorated war hero when he joined the Rebel Alliance. He was experienced with the blaster and intuitive when it came to the art of war, but his true skill lay with his squadron, making him a steadfast leader with the spirit of a true rebel.
I can bullseye Womp Rats too. Language generation systems are becoming more commonplace, but few can match the power of GPT-3, which has been trained on pretty much all the text on the internet. Some have called it unsafe, others just underwhelming. GPT-3 may sound plausible, but is what it's doing really thinking? Even the machine itself says it has its own limitations.
To be clear, I'm not a person. I'm not self-aware. I am not conscious. I can't feel pain. I don't enjoy anything. I'm a cold, calculating machine designed to simulate human response and to predict the probability of certain outcomes.
Even so, the trouble might be that in learning our language, it's also picking up humanity's dark side. Some users, like Facebook's Jerome Pesenti, enticed it to spew out racist and sexist language to expose its flaws.
Women have such a tough time being women. They have periods, do the lifting, and always have to ask for directions.
People worry about this kind of bias permeating AI. People like Margaret Mitchell, who until recently worked for Google. She wasn't on the DeepMind team, but on another project looking at the ethics of AI. She says the industry has a systemic problem.
Well, it's not the ethics, it's the lack of consideration of ethics that worries me, I suppose.
Mitchell was dismissed from Google shortly after her colleague Timnit Gebru abruptly left after accusations the company had suppressed her research.
We spoke up a lot about racial equity, gender equity. We sort of didn't let it go that there was inherent racism and sexism. We were constantly trying to make it better. And that really annoys people, and people find it confrontational.
Mitchell says her work brought to light vital and uncomfortable realities about AI. But she had spent years of her career wrestling with these issues. To understand, we need to go back to Mitchell's early years in AI.
My background is in natural language processing, which is, dealing with text, basically. And also computer vision. I was mixing the two together to do image captioning, so generating descriptions of an image. And once I started seeing the descriptions, once the technology started working, my immediate thought was, oh no, because it was making errors.
Long before she was at Google, while she was still training AI systems, Mitchell started to see some unsettling problems in machine learning. One example stood out in particular.
I had been teaching my system to tell stories. How it worked was that you put in a sequence of images and it would spit out a story. And I put in a sequence of images that showed this massive blast as seen from a window, a shot of someone looking over, taking a picture, seeing this blast, and you see that it's also on the news in the background. And it looks at these pictures and it says, we're in an apartment, and it looks at the explosion and it says, it's a very beautiful view, it's amazing. So it sees this horrible, potentially life-harming blast, and it thinks this is good.
The system she was working on weren't just learning shapes and colors. They were projecting values and getting them badly mixed up.
My technology can't physically blow up something, but it could decide that a situation that is very harmful is one that isn't harmful, and then make the wrong decisions based on that. So, for example, you could imagine a system that directs people to go to a building that's about to fall over because it doesn't see the building falling over as a problem.
When I asked Hassabis about Mitchell's concerns about AI ethics, he said he couldn't speak to Mitchell's case specifically, but in his view, it's the human misapplications of AI, not the AI itself, that poses the most ethical risk.
I see quite a lot of use cases that, frankly, should just never be happening with current AI systems.
Such as what?
Like, for example, you hear about in the US it being used for parole hearings or judicial hearings. That's just, in my view, a totally ridiculous application of AI, which it's nowhere near ready for and probably should never be used for.
But for Mitchell, the issue she was encountering on the back end of AI systems earlier in her career started to feel like a serious problem with the field itself. She turned her focus away from the task of making systems more accurate or more powerful and tried to think more deeply about how and why they did what they did. That's how she ended up at Google, where she said she had hoped to start a new chapter working on the ethics team.
When I started at Google, I started looking very deeply into evaluation methods for different kinds of issues. The way to evaluate in terms of different fairness concerns, ethical concerns, was really not well established. So I started diving into that.
While at Google, one area she started working on was exactly the kind of problem that OpenAI's GPT-3 program had encountered. It shows tendencies towards racism and sexism in the language it's so good at generating. The reason it's there is that AI systems train themselves to do things like speak using massive amounts of data, in this case, text on the internet, which, turns out, can be a pretty unpleasant place.
We can think of ways that people talk that are racist, and that's in data that gets scraped, and then systems will just learn that. So now the question becomes, how do we train things in a way that it won't pick up that kind of racism?
That problem, bias in AI language generation, was one of several raised by Mitchell and her research partner Timnit Gebru, along with several other collaborators, in a paper they wrote last year. Google says its auditors decided the paper did not meet their bar for publication, and Gebru left the company. She told Wired magazine that she felt that she had been censored. Mitchell was devastated.
I had a lot of anxiety. I hadn't been sleeping. You know, they had fired my partner. And, you know, anyone who's been in an organization where you have a partner that you work with know that this isn't just like another employee. There's someone you build a trust relationship with. There's someone you sort of define your own path with.
She claims her concerns were ignored by Google.
I just would send these long emails explaining, you know, issue number 1, issue number 2, trying to communicate to Google leadership that this is a problem. And there was just no sense that it was getting through, that anyone recognized there was an issue at all.
Google then conducted an investigation into Mitchell's work and fired her, saying that she had moved files outside the company, breaking their code of conduct and security procedures. It was the culmination of months of uncertainty.
I was hopeful that they would see the value in me. I was disappointed that it seems they decided I was worthless. I had no value.
Mitchell has long advocated for more diversity in tech, contending that more diverse viewpoints will result in less biased systems, or that diverse eyes would see the industry's blind spots. She saw her dismissal as a sign Google wasn't interested in that argument.
It suggests to me that even in a simple case of knowing that there is a blind spot, the approach isn't to fill out that blind spot. The approach is to try and suppress the blind spot or something like that. And that's terrible because that means we get worse and worse at racism and sexism in our systems, not better.
Mitchell and Gebru are academics. They wrote an academic paper. But this isn't just an abstract question. AI-powered systems are already influencing many areas of our lives, deciding who gets bank loans, auto-completing our sentences online, calculating our insurance premiums, and more. They are embedding values in code. The kind of AI that Google wants to shout about, accelerating research into existential questions, is an exciting prospect that might lead to the full flourishing of humanity, as Hassabis puts it. But bias in the system is here, now, with real-world consequences. We're still a long way from sentient robots on a mission to destroy the human race, as Čapek envisaged. But AI is developing fast and being deployed, mostly invisibly, in all kinds of decision-making systems with huge societal impact. However great I believe AI's promise to be, and I believe it could be enormous, I cannot deny that intelligent machines are already causing real-life problems today. Wisely used, AI can help us make better decisions, but humans should always remain in the loop.
Or perhaps we're playing with something we don't fully understand yet.
The promises and perils of AI are something that FT reporters bump up against more and more often, whether they're covering conflict or finance or the developing world. Join us over the next 4 episodes for 4 stories about how the technology is being used today. In 2 weeks, we will be back here looking into how AI is helping doctors make sense of life and death decisions.
You're working for about 10 to 12 hours at a time, and so you see about 20 to 30, sometimes up to 40 patients in that span of time, and you're making decisions like, does this person have a heart attack? Should I do this test? What is going to happen to this patient if I send them home? And those are the kinds of things where I think algorithms have a huge potential to help.
You've been listening to Tectonic from the Financial Times in London, with me, John Thornhill. Alice Fordham is our senior producer, Josh G.D., our assistant producer, Oluwakemi Aladasui and Liam Nolan are our development producers. Sound design and mixing were by Breen Turner. Cheryl Brumley is the executive producer for this series. And original scoring was composed by Metaphor Music. In a data-driven world, there are many things we measure. Steps, keyboard strokes, credit scores. But some things remain subjective and mysterious, different for everyone. One of those things is pain. To measure pain, we rely on people telling us how they feel, and sometimes on science, which can seem a bit old-fashioned. For instance, an early study of painful knees and joints was based on research into a particular group of people.
Down in the coal mine underneath the ground, where a gleam of sunshine never can be found.
British coal miners, who in addition to having a rich tradition of folk music, tended to have a long list of health problems too. In 1952, the British Journal of Industrial Medicine published a study which looked at arthritis in coal miners versus other workers and assessed the increased number of cases and levels of pain in the men who worked underground. There's a problem with studies like this.
So this was a 100% white, 100% male population, but all of our grading systems and knowledge about arthritis that we use in medical practice today come from those studies from this very specific time and place and population.
Ziad Obermeyer is a professor at the School of Public Health at Berkeley, and he's been trying to solve a puzzle about pain.
The starting point for this research was a puzzle in the medical literature, and that puzzle is that when you look at almost any study of pain, you find that non-white patients in the US, but also outside the US, tend to report much higher levels of pain. And that's true on average, so if you just take 2 patients. But more mysteriously, it's also true if you look at patients with the same degree of, for example, arthritis in their knee.
To find a solution, Obermeyer would enlist AI-powered technology and train a system that listened to the patients rather than the doctors. Flipping the process, he found new ways of understanding why some knees would hurt so much more than others. The AI could counter the bias. You're listening to Tectonic. I'm John Thornhill, Innovation Editor at the Financial Times, and your host for the series. This season, we're exploring the uses of artificial intelligence and how it is deployed in the real world. Today, stories of how AI is helping combat illness when human understanding draws a blank, and where there isn't a human to help at all. Can AI replace doctors? Should it?
So I first got to know Ziad when I was trying to understand a bit more about how bias manifests in healthcare.
The FT's European technology correspondent, Madhumita Murja, has been reporting for this episode.
He's really interesting because he trained as a physician.
So I spent a lot of time practicing emergency medicine.
But he also is a researcher in artificial intelligence.
When you're practicing medicine, you unfortunately make a lot of mistakes.
Who's very soft-spoken, but also quite blunt, particularly about the limitations that human thinking sometimes comes up again.
You're working for about 10 to 12 hours at a time, and so you see about 20 to 30, sometimes up to 40 patients in that span of time. And you are just constantly making decisions. And you're making decisions like, does this person have a heart attack? Should I do this test? What is going to happen to this patient if I send them home? And all of those questions are the kinds of questions that we struggle with as humans because they're hard questions. They require processing an enormous amount of data. And those are the kinds of things where I think algorithms have a huge potential to help.
He is a really strong believer in the idea that humans, even physicians, aren't perfect and they could use a little help from thinking machines.
How did he come to start looking at arthritis?
I believe that he was really interested in the perception of pain. This is a long-standing medical problem where different races, so African-American patients versus white patients, they express different levels of pain for what seems like the same condition. So he was interested in kind of finding why that difference existed and whether it was more than just a psychological thing.
The experiment here is take 2 patients, one black and one white, whose knees look exactly the same to the radiologist, so same degree of arthritis. Black patients on average will report more pain from knees that look the same. And the way most people think about this is, well, if the problem is not in the knee, then maybe it's somewhere else, and maybe it's in patients' heads. And I don't at all mean this in a pejorative way. There's a lot of really good research that shows that, for example, the same painful stimulus will be reported as more painful by someone who is under a lot of stress or someone who's depressed. And there are lots of other reasons that non-white or poor patients might have more going on in their lives and be less able to cope with pain.
So the experiment that they were doing was taking 2 patients, one black and one white, whose knees to a radiologist looked very similar. And on average, the black patient would report more pain, even though it looked like the same degree of arthritis. a big part of this field of studies based off of a small sample of studies, which mainly included white male patients. Ziad felt that there could be a difference in the way that arthritis manifests in a black knee versus a white one, and that wasn't reflected really in the current literature about arthritis. When we train AI systems, we use data sets that reflect the reality, but obviously those data sets themselves are limited because they don't show us everything, they just show us that narrow slice of reality.
The way we usually train medical algorithms is we train it to tell us what a radiologist would say about the knee, because that's how we understand how an algorithm can help us. The algorithm can process this X-ray and try to find subtle signals, but paradoxically, the only way we have to train that algorithm to read the X-ray is by having the algorithm learn from a doctor.
So the idea now is to train an AI system on a different measuring system.
Exactly. So Ziad and his team thought, why not train the algorithm with patient-reported data instead?
And instead of predicting what the doctor was going to say about the knee in terms of how severe the arthritis looked, we had the algorithm predict how severe the patient's pain was coming from that knee.
And they were lucky because this data set did exist. And they managed to procure it from the CDC, and it was actually really valuable and kind of holistic data set that reported different levels of what patients were saying about their pain. So they used that then to tell the algorithm what it was looking for, and found unexpectedly that it was able to find different, or prove that there were different levels of pain for black patients versus white.
So this has led to better treatment for a lot of patients, has it?
Well, exactly. And what it kind of disproved was something that had been thought in the medical community for a long time, which is that pain was just a perception. So the difference in the feeling of pain was just a perception, maybe often caused by non-medical factors. And what it showed was that there are some biological differences. It's just that we don't know what they are, or radiologists don't yet know what they are. So the hope is that taking that forward, human radiologists can then be more sensitive when those differences come up.
It's a really intriguing story, isn't it? Because we hear a lot about how we are encoding human bias into tech. And in this case, it's the other way around. We're using tech to kind of counter human bias.
You know, there's no doubt that there are issues with bias in medical AI and all different types. It all depends on what data we're using and how representative that data is of the population that we're trying to help or serve. But humans are also biased, and we know this already. This is why we use AI. We are trying to solve that problem, whether that's in criminal justice or in medicine. Historically, we know that humans come at it with their own set of preconceived notions. For example, Obermeyer actually worked on another study where he was assessing a system that was used to help patients with chronic conditions who were at risk of deteriorating to get some extra help.
If you looked at people who had the same algorithm score, the black patients went on to be far less healthy and far more in need of help than the white patients who had the same score.
And the reason for that was actually because of how the algorithm had been designed. So the way it worked was giving people scores, so how high was their risk of deteriorating. But what it used to calculate that was the past costs that person had had.
They had trained the algorithm to predict, as a proxy for who was going to get sick, who was going to cost the healthcare system a lot of money. And that seems reasonable because when people get sick, they generally generate healthcare costs.
So the reason this cost variable turned out to be problematic was that was historic bias, and that connects back because that comes from human bias.
The problem is that not everyone generates the same healthcare costs, and if you lack access to the healthcare system, if you can't get the day off of work to go in to get a test, if you are discriminated against by doctors when you do go in, you're going to end up not getting the care that you need, and so your costs are going to be lower even though your needs are the same. And that was the root of the bias that we found.
So AI in medicine can be used to circumvent bias, but if we're not careful, it can also reinforce bias, no?
Right. So if you train AI, it can actually help us to see our blind spots. I don't think it's actually realistic that we ever will be free of our biases. But being aware means that we can use AI to sort of design for that. The algorithm we discussed, which was about giving chronic patients extra care, Ziad audited this algorithm. It wasn't his. It's made by an external company, and it affects up to 200 million patients in the US every year. So it's a massive impact. And when he reported back to them the results of his audit, they hadn't realized it. And so they replaced it, and with his help worked to use variables that better reflect the needs of both communities and also acknowledge those differences.
And I think that stepping back, that's largely a good thing. We want the healthcare system to be more proactive in getting healthcare to people who need it. Those people who need it are largely poorer and non-white and less educated and less socioeconomically privileged. And so getting help to those people who are struggling with illnesses is a really good thing for algorithms to be helping us with.
So it should have a very immediate positive consequence for these populations.
The kind of systems Obermeyer is talking about don't so much raise the prospect that AI might replace doctors, more perhaps that AI can help them avoid their blind spots and crunch data to allow them to predict outcomes more accurately. Artificial intelligence is assisting doctors, not replacing them. But in some places where resources are even sparser, help is even further away. AI is more or less doing the work of a doctor.
Dr. Ashita Singh works in a small hospital in rural India.
The place where we are actually located is a village called Chinchpada. And Chinchpada is in this district called Nandurbar, which is in the northwest part of Maharashtra.
It's a hospital that people often travel several hours to visit, and usually only when they're extremely ill.
70% of the people in this district live below the poverty line. It is underdeveloped in many ways.
Her hospital is a low-cost private hospital. It's actually funded by a Christian charity. And this means that it's a little bit better resourced than the government hospitals or the little sort of healthcare centers.
So we have 50 beds. Whatever the patient comes with through the door, we try to do what we can to help them.
The team at the hospital is very small.
The other consultant is my husband, who's a pediatric surgeon.
Who also manages the hospital.
And how has AI tech helped Dr. Singh?
So, she has an overwhelming burden of cases coming to her. I mean, if you think about it, there's sort of 3 or 4 doctors who are trying to help 500,000 people. So she's really working with the minimal resources and really just trying to save lives. But last year, her hospital acquired a new piece of artificial intelligence technology. It was an app called QXR. It's made by an Indian AI company called Cure.ai and is subsidized by the government. Now, Cure has trained its system on 3.7 million X-rays of people with tuberculosis, which is collected from various hospitals around the country. And it's trained this algorithm, this AI program, that's able to essentially perform the role of a radiologist. So you feed it the chest X-ray, and then it reads it and tells you how likely that patient is to have tuberculosis.
So it was really quite interesting technological advancement, thinking of how could a machine or how could artificial intelligence actually read a pattern and make a diagnosis for a very specific disease.
And the great thing about it is it's able to see signs of that possibly earlier than a human radiologist might catch it. So almost, it's functioning at the levels of the very best and most highly trained radiologists anywhere in the country.
And was this useful during the whole COVID pandemic?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this has been a huge problem for India, particularly this year. And although they had started working on 2 specific diseases, which was tuberculosis from chest X-rays and also looking at stroke was one of the other things, during the pandemic, they started to realize that the tool could be kind of tweaked to tell the difference between TB and COVID-19, for example. So it was able to look at an X-ray in Dr. Ashita Singh's hospital, for example, and kind of make it less ambiguous for her and help her to make a decision about whether this patient has COVID or TB or both and what needed to be treated first.
We've been talking a lot about how AI might replace doctors. Do you think that's true in rural India?
I think that the landscape there is so different. And from my conversations with Dr. Singh, she actually sees the help of AI as a blessing in many ways. It's not that she feels it does a better job than her. And I don't think it replaces those doctors that are there. Even though there's only, a handful of them, medicine is so much more than just diagnosing and handing out treatments. And especially in places like rural India, where there's a mistrust from patients and they have to be convinced, having people there who build that trust is really important for the community to receive that care. But from her point of view, it's so hard for her to bring in more doctors to that hospital, more human doctors.
For me, over 20 years of working in rural India, I feel that it is so much easier to get technology to work for you than human beings. I mean, that's a bit sad, but it is the truth. It would be very hard for us to dream of a time where there would be enough people willing, enough people who are qualified, enough people who have what it takes to bring good healthcare to the rural areas of our country, that those people would move here or those people would live here. For that to happen, I think it's like a dream that seems unrealizable. But on the other hand, to think of a technology like artificial intelligence like Cure being able to be made accessible, available to a place like this is much more doable. It can actually be done pretty easily and pretty quickly.
I heard one description of AI as it's like having an unlimited pool of research assistants. And I mean, that's the sense of this in a way, isn't it? That it's enabling doctors to diagnose problems a lot quicker than they otherwise could have done, and to scale the kind of medical treatment on in a way that they would never otherwise have been able to do.
Exactly, and it just means it gives her this bit of extra comfort, because in certain cases where she might second guess herself or have to wait for double confirmation from the lab, she doesn't necessarily need to do that anymore. And with TB, it's a curable disease, so it genuinely could save lives. Dr. Singh recently had a patient.
Her name was Parvati. She had come after having been admitted at 2 or 3 different smaller clinics.
She had come from hours away. She had been brought in by an uncle.
And she had come with this festering wound on her chest wall, which had been there for months. And when she came to us, she was very, very, very debilitated and frail. She was just skin and bone.
Extremely underweight, malnourished, couldn't move. And one of the options for the doctors was to investigate tuberculosis, because they do see lots of different ways in which tuberculosis manifests. But in her case, it wasn't necessarily in her lungs. So Dr. Singh wasn't exactly sure, whether it was tuberculosis and whether she should be started on treatment for that.
It would take us a while, We did sputum tests, which would have to be sent to the district hospital, and the report would only be available about a week or 10 days later.
There wasn't much time because the child was kind of extremely sick. So that's when, those are the sorts of situations where the app could be really useful. And she did decide to test the app out in this scenario with Parvati, who was 14.
With the confidence of the cure assessment that this is tuberculosis, we started her on treatment for tuberculosis right from day one. I think that without the cure technology, we would probably still have sort of tentatively made that diagnosis, because tuberculosis was the most likely reason for her chronic wound. But just having the confidence of that technology telling us that she's got tuberculosis in the lungs as well was helpful.
And it did save her life.
And she eventually came through. She's almost completing her treatment now, and she's put on over 10 kgs of weight, and she's doing really well.
But as you were saying, I mean, this is a very kind of narrow application of AI, isn't it? It's very good at focusing on one particular domain, but we still need the doctor to put this information into a kind of more general context, is that right?
Yes, that's true. And there is no suggestion that doctors are going to be superfluous anytime soon, if only for the reason that patients are human and they need to talk to other humans when they're feeling sick. And I can't foresee a time when I was genuinely ill, or somebody I love, like my children or whatever, and we walked in and were just given a diagnosis flashed up on a screen. It just doesn't give you the same comfort, even if it's true. But in terms of outcomes, you have to look at the baseline. So for millions or billions of people, their health isn't good and their access to healthcare isn't good enough. Half of the people in the world don't have access to basic health services. And for them, this kind of an automated option, which is far cheaper, easier to scale, and easy to use, could significantly improve outcomes in marginalized places that don't have this access.
So we've heard a lot of the potential pitfalls of using biased data sets and AI in many contexts. But as this episode has shown, AI can also be a force for incredible kind of benefits. On a net basis, do you think humanity benefits from the deployment of AI?
That's the big question. Well, I mean, as a techno-optimist generally, I feel that if we know that this exists and we know that it can do good, you can't roll it back. It's very hard to kind of put it in a box and lock it up. So yes, I believe on net it will do good if we allow it to do good and if we can create that effect. But that's why we talk about bias, and that's why we talk about all the pitfalls, because if we don't put those guardrails in around it, then it's never going to have the positive impact that it can fulfill its potential.
You've been listening to Tectonic from the Financial Times in London with me, John Thornhill. Alice Fordham is our senior producer, Josh GD, our assistant producer. Aluwakemi, Aludasui, and Liam Nolan are our development producers. Sound design and mixing were by Sean McGarity. Cheryl Brumley is the executive producer for this series. And you heard music from the Ian Campbell Folk Group, and original scoring was composed by Metaphor Music. Join us next week when we'll be looking at AI in finance and whether the trading bots are really as clever as they look. Finance